Hey, welcome back. I am so glad you're here tonight. Picture this. You've been walking since sunrise. Your feet ache, your back is stiff, and the only thing keeping you going is a faint glow of lantern light you spotted through the trees about a mile back. You finally push open a heavy wooden door, and warmth hits you like a hug. Wood smoke, roasting, meet the low hum of voices. And somewhere in the back, someone laughing a little too loud at their own joke. You've just walked into a medieval inn. Now, here is what I want you to think about. When most people imagine a medieval inn, what do they actually picture? Tanker's ale flying through the air. Some shadowy figure in the corner definitely planning something sinister. Maybe a lute? Maybe a barmaid. Here is the thing. Almost everything you picture is wrong. And tonight, I want to tell you what it was actually like, because the real story is so much more interesting than the movie version. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling is something that makes your evenings a little slower and a little richer, it would mean so much if you hit subscribe and left a like on this video. And I am genuinely curious, where are you watching this right now? Tucked into bed in a favorite armchair, maybe somewhere I would never guess. Leave it in the comments. I love reading every single one. Now, dim those lights, let a fan hum softly in the background, and let us travel back together. Here is something that might genuinely surprise you. For most of the early medieval period, roughly the years 500 through 1100, if you were a traveler on the roads of Europe, there was no inn waiting for you. None. The whole idea of paying a stranger for a bed and a meal simply did not exist in any organized way. What you had were two options: the kindness of the church or the kindness of strangers. Monasteries were the original hotels of the medieval world. Almost every religious house in Europe maintained a guest hall where travelers could stop, eat, and sleep for free. It was a Christian duty. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, literally instructs monks to welcome every guest as if they were receiving Christ himself, which is a beautiful sentiment until you realize that by the year 900, some monasteries were housing hundreds of travelers a week and were absolutely overwhelmed. For poorer travelers, the only other option was knocking on someone's door. In many parts of early medieval Europe, Ireland, Wales, parts of Scandinavia, turning away a weary traveler was considered genuinely shameful. You fed them. You gave them a corner to sleep. You asked no payment and trusted that the road would be kind to you someday too. But somewhere in the late 1100s, Europe begins to change in ways that made both of those options collapse under their own weight. Trade routes expanded. The wool trade, the cloth trade, the spice trade merchants began moving in numbers the medieval world had never seen. Pilgrimage became almost a cultural phenomenon, with thousands making their way to shrines in Canterbury and Rome, in Santiago de Compostela in Spain. The roads filled up with messengers, soldiers, royal administrators. Monasteries could not keep up, neither could the goodwill of neighbors. And into this gap stepped one of the most underappreciated professions in all of medieval history, the professional innkeeper. Historians describe this moment as one of the earliest examples of what we would now call service capitalism, the idea that a stranger could walk through your door, receive shelter food, and care for their horse, and pay a fixed price for each that was genuinely new. It sounds obvious to us. To a person living in 1200, it was a revolutionary idea. Now, here is something most people do not realize. The medieval inn and the medieval tavern were not the same thing, and the ale house was a third thing entirely. A tavern. The word comes from the Latin taberna, meaning a shop, was primarily a place to drink wine, often imported from France or the Rye Valley. You could eat there. You might find entertainment, but a tavern was not expecting you to spend the night. An alehouse was even more informal. In many villages, it was not a building at all. just the home of whoever happened to be brewing ale that week. You would know which house by the bundle of branches called an ale stake hung above the door. People brought their own cups from home, paid a few pennies, and sat with the neighbors. The ale had no hops. Hops did not become common until the Renaissance, and it went sour within 2 or 3 days, brewed constantly, and sold as fast as it was made. People called it liquid bread because it genuinely provided real nutrition in a world where food was never guaranteed. And then there was the inn. The inn was built for travelers who needed not just a drink, but a full suite of services, a meal, a bed, and crucially, stabling for their horses. In a world where your horse was your vehicle, and often your most valuable possession, the fact that an inn would shelter your animal while you slept was not a small thing. It was the whole point, a typical medieval inn, and we have surprisingly detailed records from places like Winchester and Canterbury had several distinct parts. You entered the main hall first, a large communal room with long wooden tables, benches, and a hearth that was the heart of the building. This was where travelers ate together, drank together, and exchanged news and rumors. Beyond the hall sat the kitchen, kept slightly separate because fire was a constant catastrophic risk. Innkeepers invested enormous sums into their buildings and carried no insurance. Fire was the nightmare that kept them up at night. Then there were the sleeping chambers, and this is where your expectations will probably be challenged. The idea of a traveler getting their own private room is almost entirely a fantasy. In most inns, sleeping was communal. You might find yourself in a room with 8 to 12 straw beds, each one holding 2, 3, or even 4 people strangers you'd never met. One 14th century account describes a traveler arriving at a full inn, being offered a spot in a bed already holding 2 other men, and considering himself genuinely fortunate. The alternative was the stable, which was, by the way, warmer than you might think. Private rooms existed, but they were rare, expensive, and mostly found in larger inns in major cities. Travelers who could afford them still tended to sleep with their valuables tucked beneath their bodies just in case. By the year 1379, we know this from surviving English tax records, most major provincial towns already had between 10 and 20 established inns. Market towns had 2 to 5. Even small towns usually had at least 1. And remarkably, almost all of the inns operating in 1600 were already in existence 200 years earlier. The infrastructure appeared quickly driven by the explosion of commercial travel, and then it stayed. That word infrastructure is exactly right. The same way we think of roads and bridges as systems that make everything else possible, the network of medieval inns made commerce, pilgrimage, and governance function. Without them, the merchant could not move his goods. The pilgrim could not complete her journey. The royal messenger could not carry the king's letters. The inn was not decorative. It was structural. And here is the detail that I find the most quietly moving. Most people in the medieval world did not travel, not because they were forbidden to, but because travel was expensive, dangerous, and unnecessary for most ordinary lives. Most people lived and died within 30 miles of where they were born, so the inn existed at the edge of the ordinary world, a place where people from completely different lives briefly shared the same smoky room, the same fire, the same pot of cottage. A wool merchant from Bristol, a German pilgrim on it, way to Rome, a woman with fine lace making her way to a market fair towns over. All of them for one night together. In a world with no phones and no newspapers, the inn was where Europe kept talking to itself. It was where you learned that a bridge had washed out 2 counties over, that a war had ended somewhere to the east, that the price of wool in London had changed. The inn was the news. It was the town square. It was the room where the wider world showed up. So the next time someone describes a medieval inn as rough and smelly and dangerous, They are not entirely wrong, but they are missing most of the story because it was also one of the most important rooms in the entire medieval world. And we have only just opened the door. Stay with me, because in the very next part, we follow the roads that made these inns necessary in the first place and meet the people who actually walk through that door. Not the ones you expect, not even close. If you have been following along from part 1, welcome back. I'm glad you stayed. And if you're just joining in now, here is all you need to know. We're not talking about the Hollywood version of medieval inns. We are talking about the real thing, and trust me, it is stranger, messier, and far more fascinating. So, let us talk about the road, because before you can understand what an inn meant to a medieval traveler, you have to understand what the road had already put them through. Here is a question I want you to sit with for a second. When you imagine a medieval road, what do you picture? A wide, dusty path through open countryside, maybe something with cartwheel tracks pressed deep into the dirt, rolling through picturesque English hills. The reality was often something closer to a nightmare. Most medieval roads in Europe were not roads in any meaningful modern sense. They were tracks, sometimes paved with the crumbling remnants of old Roman stonework that no one had maintained in centuries, and sometimes nothing more than a semi-trampled line through fields and forest, wide enough for a horse but treacherous in the rain, nearly impossible in winter. A French legal text from the late 13th century, the Codium de Beauvais, actually had to lay out the minimum widths required for different kinds of travel, primarily because it was complaining about people stealing the paving stones and wooden planks from the road surface to use elsewhere. People were literally dismantling the roads while others were trying to use them. During the winter of 1395 and 1396, the route between the French towns of Menin and Lille became so saturated with mud that it was described in official records as completely impossible. Not difficult, not inconvenient, impassable. Travelers had to abandon the road entirely and cut across someone's fields, which was technically allowed under medieval law if the proper route was unusable, but which was obviously not very popular with the people whose crops got destroyed in the process. And yet, people traveled constantly. This is one of the things that surprises most people when they study the medieval period seriously. We tend to assume that ordinary people in the Middle Ages stayed put, rooted to their villages, never venturing beyond the horizon they could see from their doorstep. And while it is true that most people's daily lives were intensely local, the medieval road system was absolutely packed with a specific and fascinating cast of characters. Let me introduce you to some of them. The merchants came first in terms of sheer economic weight. By the 13th and 14th centuries, European commerce had become genuinely sophisticated. The wool trade between England and Flanders, what is now modern-day Belgium, was so important that it essentially funded the English crown for generations. Cloth merchants moved between markets in London, Gent, and Paris. Italian banking families from Florence and Genoa had agents traveling across the continent. The Hanseatic League, a trading confederation centered in northern Germany, coordinated commerce between nearly 200 towns across 8 modern-day countries. These were not casual day trips. These were men and occasionally women covering hundreds of miles with heavy goods and serious money. In a world where every toll bridge, every muddy stretch of road, every night spent uncertain of where they would sleep was a genuine business risk. Then came the pilgrims, and here is where things get genuinely surprising. Pilgrimage in the medieval period was not a marginal religious activity practiced by a handful of devout eccentrics. It was enormous. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral, established after his assassination in 1170, was drawing tens of thousands of visitors a year by the 13th century. The route to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, and the famous Camino de Santiago was traveled by people from every corner of Europe, Germany, Italy, France, England, Scandinavia. A single major feast day in Rome could pull thousands of pilgrims into the city, and historians note that by the 15th century, the route to Jerusalem was organized enough to be compared almost directly to a package tour. People saved for years. They planned months in advance. They carried letters of introduction sewn into their clothing. What I find quietly remarkable about medieval pilgrims is how much they look like modern tourists. The faith was genuine, but so was the curiosity. Contemporary observers were already noting with some amusement that more than a few pilgrims seemed less interested in earning spiritual merit and more interested in simply seeing the world. Geoffrey Chaucer understood this perfectly. The Canterbury Tales, his most celebrated work, begins with a group of pilgrims setting out from the Tabbed in an S just south of London. And if you read those characters closely, they are not a portrait of devout religious devotion. They are a portrait of people who wanted an adventure, who were tired of their ordinary lives, who craved exactly what the road had always offered: the shock of new people, new landscapes, new stories. Then there were the royal messengers. This is a group that does not get nearly enough attention in popular history, and honestly, they deserve their own story entirely by the year 1200. With England's royal administration permanently based in Westminster, the king needed a constant, reliable flow of information flowing between London and wherever the court was traveling on any given week. Messengers were therefore essentially professional road users, men whose entire job was covering distance as fast as physically possible. Historical records show some of these riders covering 52 to 56 mi in a single day. To put that in perspective, that is the distance from New York City to the middle of New Jersey and back in one day on horseback on those roads. In medieval weather, they changed horses at regular intervals, sometimes at inns, sometimes at royal posting stations. And this relay system was quite literally the origin of what would eventually become the postal service. There were also the itinerant clergy, traveling friars who wandered between villages and towns, preaching, hearing confessions, collecting alms, bishops with distant parishes to visit, abbots summoned to meetings in the capital. The church hierarchy was almost as mobile as the merchant class, and they used the same roads, stopped at the same inns, and complained about the same mud. And then, at the margins of all of this respectable traffic, moved a whole other world of people, wandering minstrels and musicians who traded entertainment for food and shelter, traveling physicians, carrying their instruments and their questionable remedies from town to town, students moving between university cities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, often with very little money and enormous intellectual ambitions, soldiers returning from campaigns, sometimes wealthy and sometimes broken, people fleeing things they could not talk about, people searching for things they could not name, all of them on the same roads, all of them needing eventually the same thing. Now, I want to tell you something about how most of these people actually navigated because there were no road signs. There were no detailed maps available to ordinary travelers. The Guff Map of England, one of the earliest road maps we have, was created in the late 14th century and shows little more than approximate distances between major towns marked by lines. For most of the medieval period, navigation worked almost entirely through oral information. You asked people, you asked at the inn, you asked other travelers coming from the direction you were headed. The innkeeper himself was often an invaluable source of road intelligence: which bridges were out, which stretches were dangerous, which towns had a market on that day and might have more traffic, more safety in numbers. This dependence on local knowledge meant that the inn was not just a physical stopping point, it was a node in a living information network. Every time a traveler arrived, they brought fresh news from the road behind them. Every time they left, they carried news from the inn forward over weeks and months. Information about prices, politics, weather, conflict. Opportunity traveled across Europe in exactly this way, leaping from inn to inn, carried in the memories of tired, muddy, hungry people who had pushed through terrible roads to arrive at a warm fire and a bowl of something hot. Think about what it would actually feel like to walk into that room after a day like that. You've been riding since before sunrise. The road turned to deep mud somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, and your horse lost a shoe, and you had to walk the last 4 miles leading the animal by the bridle, because there was no blacksmith until the next town. Your back has a specific kind of ache that only comes from long hours in a saddle. You're not entirely sure you went the right way at the last fork. And then that door, that warmth, the smell of something actually cooking. Someone who has never experienced genuine road fatigue might look at a medieval inn and see a rough, primitive place. Someone who has just come in from that road would see something that looked very nearly like heaven. The relationship between the medieval traveler and the medieval inn was forged entirely by the misery that came before it. The worse the journey, the more the inn meant, and the roads, as we have just seen, were very often very bad indeed. There is something almost poetic in that a system where suffering and relief were designed to find each other, where the harder the road, the warmer the fire felt, and the road had one more thing it regularly did to travelers that made the inn even more essential. It scared them. Bandits on medieval roads were not a myth. They were a documented, persistent, genuinely serious problem. Traveling alone was considered genuinely dangerous, which is why most experienced travelers joined groups whenever they could. Merchants hired guards. Pilgrims moved in organized bands, and even wealthy individuals rarely rode unaccompanied through unfamiliar territory after dark. The stretches of road between towns, particularly those passing through dense forest, were known to harbor people who had decided that robbing travelers was a more reliable income than farming. And as darkness fell, the choice was simple. Find shelter or take your chances in the open. An inn, even a bad one, meant walls and a roof and other people around. It meant your horse was locked in a stable rather than tethered in a ditch. It meant that whatever happened in the night, you were not facing it alone. Which is why when that door swung open and the innkeeper looked you over, and make no mistake, they very much looked you over, what you were really asking for was more than a bed. You were asking for safety, for warmth, for the ordinary miracle of another human being who was going to feed you and let you sleep under their roof. The inn was the answer the medieval world built for the question the road kept asking. And once you were inside, the real experience began, because the inn was not just a place to rest. It was a world unto itself. What that world looked like, the food, the rooms, the people, the noise, the strange and sometimes unsettling rituals of medieval hospitality. That is exactly where we're headed next. Right then, you have survived the road. You have made it through the mud and the uncertainty and the fading daylight. You pushed open that heavy door you stepped inside, and the warmth wrapped around you like something you had almost forgotten existed. Now the real question begins. What exactly were you walking into? Because from the outside, a medieval inn could look almost deceptively simple. A timber frame building 2 stories in most cases with a yard or courtyard behind it, and a stable block set off to one side. Not grand, not particularly beautiful, but solid, functional, built to absorb the constant traffic of strangers and come out the other side intact. Step through that door and you are immediately in the hall. Not a foyer, not a reception area, not a lobby, the hall. And the hall in a medieval inn was everything. Dining room, common room, gathering space, and for the poorest guests, the place where they would sleep that very night on the floor rushes when all the beds upstairs were taken. It was the beating heart of the entire building, and it never really quieted down from the moment guests started arriving until the fire finally burned low somewhere in the small hours. The furniture was simple and brutally practical. Long wooden trestle tables, the kind that could be broken down and moved to the walls at night to clear floor space. Benches rather than chairs, because benches fit more people and could also double as beds in a pinch, and at one end or in the center of the room, depending on the building's age. The hearth, the fire, the thing that everything else in the room organized itself around medieval hearths. In inns were not the decorative fireplaces we picture today. Working fires sometimes, open in the center of the room with a hole in the roof above to let the smoke out, an older design that left the whole room perpetually hazy, and in later, more sophisticated buildings, a proper chimney built into the wall. Above the fire hung iron hooks and chains from which cooking pots dangled. The smell of whatever was in those pots was essentially the smell of the inn itself. Wood smoke and stewing meat and the yeasty warmth of ale were so embedded in these buildings that travelers could smell a good inn before they could see it on a foggy evening. The floors were earthen in older or poorer establishments, covered with rushes that were supposed to be changed regularly, and very often were not. In better, particularly by the 14th and 15th centuries, you might find stone flagging, which was easier to clean, but considerably colder underfoot. The walls were bare plaster in modest establishments, or hung with cloth in wealthier ones, not for decoration exactly, but for insulation. Medieval buildings leaked cold air through every gap in their timber frames, and anything you could hang on a wall to break the draft was considered worthwhile. Light came from tallow candles, cheap smoke oaky, and with a particular animal smell that some people found repulsive, or from rush lights, which were essentially dried rushes soaked in grease and burned on iron holders. Good beeswax candles were reserved for the innkeeper's own quarters and for wealthy guests who paid extra for them. If you were a regular traveler without particular means, you ate and drank in the yellow, uncertain flicker of tallow, which is part of why medieval halls always had that slightly atmospheric quality we romanticize now. It was not romantic. It was just cheaper than proper candles. Now, here is something I find genuinely fascinating about the layout of these buildings, and it is a detail that most people never think about. The inn was almost always built around a courtyard. You arrived through a gate, sometimes a full archway large enough for a loaded cart to pass through, and the yard behind was where the real logistics of travel happened. Horses were unloaded here. Merchants' goods were transferred and sometimes stored here. Grooms worked the stables that ran along one or two sides of the yard. The kitchen was often accessible from the yard, keeping the risk of kitchen fires slightly away from the main sleeping building. And in larger, more established inns, there might be a well in the courtyard, which was significant. Clean water was not a given in a medieval town, and an inn with its own water source was advertising something genuinely valuable. A few surviving inns from the medieval period still give us a clear picture of this courtyard design. The New Inn in Gloucester, England, built around 1457, still has its original gallered courtyard. The galleries covered wooden walkways running along the upper floor of the courtyard gave guests access to the sleeping chambers above without needing to go back through the main hall. They also, incidentally, created the earliest version of what theatrical historians believe may have been the inspiration for the stage and gallery design of later Elizabeth and playhouses. The inn courtyard as prototype theater, which, when you think about it, makes a certain amount of sense. Both were places where a crowd gathered and something was performed for their entertainment. But let us go upstairs, because that is where most travelers spent the part of the night they were not already spending in the hall. The stairs were narrow. This was not an oversight. Narrow stairs took up less floor space, and floor space in a medieval building was precious. They were steep, often with irregular rises between steps, because they were built by craftsmen working without standardized measurements. If you were carrying a candle, which you would be because the upper floor had no lighting of its own, and you were also carrying your pack, and possibly slightly unsteady after an evening of inal, those stairs represented a genuine hazard. Historical records mention guests taking tumbles on in stairs, often enough that it clearly was not a rare occurrence. At the top of the stairs, a corridor, or, in older buildings, simply a series of rooms opening off one another with no separate hallway at all. The sleeping chambers themselves ranged enormously in quality and size. An inn with, say, 10 to 17 chambers, as records suggest, was typical for a reasonably large establishment, might have anywhere from 1 bed to 3 beds per room. And those beds. Let us talk about those beds because they were nothing like what you're lying on right now. The mattress was a canvas sack stuffed with straw, sometimes with wool or hair, or rags mixed in, which made it slightly more comfortable and slightly heavier. The French word for straw, pale, gave us the word pallet, which is what these things were. Pallets. Serviceable, not comfortable in any modern sense. The canvas covering called ticking was tightly woven specifically to prevent fleas and lice from moving through it too freely. I want to be careful about how I say this next part, but I also want to be accurate. Lice were a near universal fact of life in the medieval period, affecting people at every level of society. What was considered shameful was not lice but fleas, which were associated with uncleanliness and poor character. Even the beds of kings were treated regularly to try to manage this reality. At an inn where the same mattress had held dozens of different travelers in the month preceding your arrival, the situation was simply part of the bargain you had accepted by walking through the door. Here is the etiquette detail that I love most about medieval and sleeping, because it tells you something real about how people navigated an uncomfortable situation with a kind of pragmatic grace. When you shared a bed with a stranger, which you very likely there were actual understood rules of conduct, you were expected to lie still. You were expected not to steal the blanket. You were expected to remain on your side of the bed. An Italian proverb from the period put it directly: in a narrow bed, get thee in the middle. The English had a phrase to pig, meaning to sleep pressed against one or more bedfellows. These were not jokes. They were the lived reality of travel, handled with a kind of resigned social contract that most people simply accepted because there was no alternative. And in the very poorest establishments, this is the part that genuinely surprises people. There was no bed at all in the way we would recognize it. Historical records describe some cheap roadside stops, where travelers paid a fraction of a penny to sit on a wooden bench, leaning their arms over a horizontal rope strung at chest height for support. In the morning, the rope was cut or sometimes let down dramatically at a set hour, and the sleepers, such as they were, tumbled forward and were expected to move on. This is the distant ancestor of the English phrase, time to cut the rope, meaning time to end something. The rope itself, the bench, the cramped shoulder-to-shoulder arrangement in the dark that was the cheapest accommodation the medieval world had on offer. What did a private room look like for those who could afford one somewhat better, but not dramatically so? A bed with curtains around it, the curtains serving the same purpose as modern blankets, trapping body heat rather than providing privacy. A small table, a stool, and in better establishments, a candle holder fixed to the wall. The door might have a latch. It might even have a lock, though the key was held by the innkeeper, which tells you something about the power dynamics at play. And the floor, even in a private room, was earthen or stone and cold. Some rooms had a fireplace, many did not. There is one more feature of the medieval inn that I feel compelled to mention, if only because It is the detail that tends to make modern audiences the most surprised. The garderobe, the latrine, the facilities. In larger, better constructed inns, there was a stone or timber projection built out from an upper floor wall with a hole cut in the floor. What went in came out the bottom and landed either in a cesspit below or in some cases directly into the street. This was not considered particularly scandalous. It was engineering such as it was. In smaller establishments, the solution was a chamber pot under the bed, a clay or sometimes put vessel that every traveler was expected to use, and that servant would empty in the morning. Medieval healthcare guides actually recommended keeping the chamber pot nearby for exactly this purpose, since getting up in the dark and navigating those steep stairs in the middle of the night was its own kind of risk. I realize that by this point, some of you may be reconsidering your romanticized feelings about medieval travel, and I think that is actually the honest response. The inn was not glamorous. It was not comfortable by any measurement we would use today. The beds were hard, the rooms were cold, the company was unpredictable, and the facilities were charitable word minimal. And yet there is something in all of this that I think we genuinely miss when we view the medieval world through the lens of our modern expectations. For a traveler who had spent 10 hours on a medieval road in the rain, what the inn offered was not luxury. It was something more essential than that. It was human company. It was a fire. It was something warm to eat. It was the sound of other people breathing nearby in the darkness, which in a world where the roads outside were genuinely dangerous and the forests beyond the town walls held very real risks, was not nothing. It was in fact quite a lot. The medieval concept of what constituted a good night was different from ours. Not worse necessarily, just calibrated to a different baseline. When warmth and safety were not guaranteed, they became the entire point. Which brings us to the question of what you were actually eating and drinking in that hall downstairs. Because the food at a medieval inn was its own extraordinary world, and it is far more interesting and occasionally far more suspicious than you might expect. Let us sit at the table for a moment. Not your table. Mine, of course, is far more comfortable, but the long communal table inside a medieval inn somewhere in 14th century England on an evening in late October. The fire is going. The hall smells of something simmering. Around you, other travelers are settling onto the benches, shaking the rain off their cloaks, passing a shared cup without a second thought. You are about to eat, and the question is, what exactly are you getting? This is the part of the story where I have to be a little honest with you, because what people imagine they would eat at a medieval inn and what they actually would have eaten are two very different things. Hollywood has given us a particular image, heaping platters of roasted meats, whole chickens on spits legs of some unidentifiable animal being gnawed, with gusto, rivers of dark ale and bold wine. And look, that version is not entirely fictional. It just describes a very specific slice of the medieval dining experience. The expensive slice, the festive slice, the slice that belonged to people who could afford to pay considerably more than the going rate. For most travelers on most evenings, the meal was simpler, much simpler. The thing you were most likely to eat anywhere in medieval Europe, regardless of country or century, was pottage. Say it with me. Pottage. It is one of those wonderful old words that describes something completely unglamorous in a very dignified way. Pottage was essentially a thick stew, a pot of simmering liquid containing whatever the kitchen had available that day. Oats, leeks, cabbage, dried peas, beans, barley, root vegetables when they were in season, a bit of salted pork if the innkeeper was feeling generous or the season had been kind. Herbs. Certainly, medieval cooks were considerably more sophisticated with their use of herbs than they are given credit for, and sometimes a small quantity of spices if the establishment was trying to impress its clientele. Now, here is the detail that I find equal parts fascinating and deeply unsettling. Many inns kept what was called a perpetual stew, a single cauldron hung over the fire into which new ingredients were added each day, and from which portions were ladled out continuously, not a pot that was emptied, cleaned, and started fresh each morning. The same pot ongoing perpetually. Some historians suggest these perpetual stews ran for weeks. Others describe recipes and practices that suggest the pot was never fully emptied at all, just topped up constantly, evolving the flavor building and shifting over time as ingredients came and went. I want to give you a moment to sit with that. If you are the kind of person who thinks carefully about what you're eating, the perpetual stew presents a philosophical challenge that I find genuinely amusing. On one hand, it was practical genius. The cook always had something hot and ready to serve regardless of when guests arrived. There was no waste. On the other hand, you were essentially eating a living history of everything that had passed through that kitchen over the past several days or weeks in one warm bowl. Medieval people were not bothered by this, not because they lacked sophistication, but because their entire relationship with food preservation and freshness was built around completely different assumptions than ours. When you have no refrigeration, no canning, no plastic wrap, the question is not whether your food is fresh. It is whether it is safe and whether it will keep you fed. A pot that has been simmering continuously for days is actually, in a practical sense, more consistently hot, and therefore more consistently safe than food that has been prepared and allowed to cool. The fire did the work that our refrigerators do, now just in a completely opposite way. Your bread at this meal was also not what you might expect. The finest bread made from sifted white wheat flour called weistel, or meine, was served to wealthy guests, or sold at a premium. Most travelers received what was known as household bread or cheat bread, a dense dark loaf made from wheat mixed with rye or barley, which was significantly heavier and more filling, but considerably less pleasant to eat by itself. And here is where things get genuinely interesting. At many inns, particularly in the earlier medieval period, your bread did not come on a plate. Your bread was the plate. A trencher, from the French word meaning to cut or slice, was a thick slab of 2 or 3 days old bread, flat, and hardened enough to hold solid food without collapsing. Your meat, your pottage, your cheese would be placed directly on top of it. As the meal progressed, the trencher absorbed the juices and gravies, becoming progressively more edible itself. When you were done, you had 2 options, depending on your standing at the table. Eat the trencher or pass it to the servants, or throw it to the dogs that were almost always present in a medieval hall floor, doing important work as the establishment's cleanup crew. For poorer guests, the trencher's plate was not waste. It was dessert. Now, I want to talk about something that I suspect you've been wondering about since part 1 of this story, because it is one of the most persistent myths about the medieval period. And the truth is considerably more nuanced than the myth. Did people at a medieval inn drink ale instead of water because water was dangerous? Here is my honest answer. Sort of, but not in the way the story usually goes. The popular version that medieval people universally avoided water because it was poisonous and drank only ale and wine for safety is not accurate. Historians who have studied this carefully, looking at chronicles, medical texts, household accounts, and religious records, consistently find evidence that water was consumed regularly throughout the medieval period. A 10th century Anglo-Saxon text captures it perfectly, almost casually. "I'll if I have any," or "water if I have no ale." Water was not some terrifying forbidden substance. It was ordinary. It was what the poor drank when they had nothing else. What was true, however, was that water sources varied enormously in quality, and that medieval people were actually quite discerning about this. They knew that clear, cold running water from a spring or a clean river upstream was fine. They knew that stagnant water or water near a town's waste disposal areas was likely to make you sick. A 14th century monk in the city of Lege went so far as to list water as his preferred drink recommended above ale and beer. City governments in London, Paris, and Siena all spent considerable resources in the 13th and 14th centuries constructing water conduit systems to bring clean spring water into their streets, specifically for public drinking. But here is where the myth has a grain of genuine truth embedded in it, and it is specifically relevant to the inn. Travelers faced a particular problem that residents did not. When you were on the road far from home, far from water sources you knew and trusted, the local water was genuinely uncertain. The English physician John of Gaddesden, writing in the early 14th century, specifically warned travelers to be cautious of unfamiliar waters, noting that strange water could upset the stomach and cause illness, a concern that was based on genuine observed experience, even if the underlying science was not yet understood. A 15th century Italian writer advising travelers heading to the Holy Land suggested they bring their own barrels of water and wine precisely because they could not know the quality of water they would encounter. So what did a traveling merchant in 14th century England drink at the inn? Most likely ale, the specific ale that the inn brewed or sourced locally, which was known and consistent, a quantity of which was effectively baked into the cost of your lodging, whether you wanted it or not. Ale in the medieval period was low in alcohol content, by modern standards sometimes as weak as 1%, and was genuinely nutritious, providing calories that hard-traveling people needed. It was not a substitute for water out of fear. It was the preferred option out of reasonable preference availability and the genuine calorific value it provided. Wine was available at better inns, and this gets complicated in its own interesting way. The wine available at most English inns was almost entirely imported from France, specifically from the Bordeaux region and the Loire Valley, and from the Rhine in Germany. It traveled by ship and then by cart, which meant it was often partially oxidized by the time it reached you. Medieval wine spoiled relatively quickly without the preservation techniques we now take for granted. A contemporary recipe for what was called hippocras, spiced, sweetened wine, was partly a preservation technique and partly a flavor correction, because warm wine blended with honey, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves could mask the early stages of going off and frankly tasted better than the raw product anyway. On a cold autumn evening at an inn in Yorkshire, a warm cup of spiced wine was not just a luxury. It was one of the small, genuine pleasures that made the journey worth taking. And then there was fermented honey wine, which had a long history in Northern Europe and was still found at many inns period, though it was declining in popularity relative to ale and wine by the 13th century. And cider, particularly in the apple-growing regions of England and northern France, and perry made from pears. The drink menu at a medieval inn was actually more varied than most people imagine, layered with regional specificity and seasonal availability in ways that no modern drink menu is, simply because everything came from somewhere close and nothing was manufactured to be consistent. Now, before we leave the table entirely, there are two more things about eating at a medieval inn that I want to walk you through, because they reveal something important about how medieval people understood the social act of sharing a meal with strangers. The first is that you did not use a fork. This is not because medieval people were unsophisticated. It is because forks, as eating implements, were genuinely not in common use in England or most of Northern Europe until well into the 16th and 17th centuries. You ate with a spoon for your pottage and soups. You used a small personal knife, which you brought yourself carried on your belt to cut your meat. And for solid foods, You used your hands with a competence and neatness that was considered a mark of good breeding and table manners. Eating properly with your hands in a communal setting was a skill, and people took it seriously. The second is the shared cup. At most inn tables, particularly for ordinary travelers, there was not a personal cup for each person. There was a shared cup passed around the table from which everyone drank in turn. This seems alarming by modern standards. In the context of medieval daily life, it was simply ordinary part of the communal texture of a world where personal boundaries around objects in space were drawn very differently than they are now. To drink from a shared cup with strangers was an act of community, a small, unremarkable piece of the social fabric of the inn. You were in this tiny gesture acknowledging your temporary membership in this group of people who had ended up at the same table on the same evening, bound by nothing except the road and the rain and the need for something warm. There is something in that I find genuinely touching, actually, the shared cup. The trencher passed to the dog, the perpetual stew that had been going since Tuesday and was somehow still going. Medieval dining at an inn was not fancy. It was not refined in the way a modern restaurant is refined. But it was human in the deepest sense of the word. It was people feeding each other, accepting the imperfections of the available making do, and finding something like comfort in the doing of it. But the man running all of this, the one who kept the fire going, and the stew simmering and decided who got the good room and who slept on the floor, rushes. That is a figure we have barely met yet. And the medieval innkeeper, it turns out, was one of the most powerful, complicated, and surprisingly fascinating people you would ever encounter on the road. Something I have been thinking about since we last talked, and I want to share it with you before we go any further into this story, is that we have spent 4 parts now describing the inn as a place, the building, the road that led to it, the food on the table, the straw on the floor. But we have barely touched the most interesting character in the whole picture, the innkeeper. And here is the thing. If you walked into a medieval inn carrying the assumptions most people carry today, you would probably picture someone more or less like Chaucer's Harry Bailey, the jolly boisterous host of the Tabed Inn in the Canterbury Tales. Loud, sociable, a little theatrical, fundamentally in service to his guests, a man who lived to please, an accommodating soul with an apron and a good story. That image is charming. It is also, if we're being precise about it, quite misleading. The medieval innkeeper was, in reality, one of the most powerful figures in his town, not the most celebrated, not the most visible in the way that a lord or a bishop was visible, but powerful in a very particular, very practical sense, the kind of power that comes from controlling access to something everyone needs and no one can do without. Let us start with what the historical record actually shows us. Historian John Hare, whose research on medieval English inns remains one of the most authoritative studies of the subject, found consistently that innkeepers were not peripheral figures scraping by on a modest trade. They were, in his words, a crucial part of the economic infrastructure of the country, men who contributed actively to local political and cultural life, and whose business success was directly tied to their town's broader prosperity. And the examples he found when he dug into the actual records are extraordinary. Take Richard Kingsmill innkeeper in the town of Basingstoke, working between 1455 and 1470. When you list what this single innkeeper accomplished alongside running his establishment, the picture becomes remarkable. He served as royal constable in 1455, as town bailiff in 1464-65, and again in 1487 and 8. He was appointed a justice of the peace, effectively a local judge. He sat as a member of Parliament. He served as a tax assessor, and he acted as official representative for the village of Mapledurwell in a legal dispute with their priest. His son went on to become a justice of the common pleas, one of the most significant legal offices in medieval England. Stop and think about that for a moment. A man whose day job was technically running a public house was simultaneously judge, legislator, tax official, and legal representative. That is not an outlier. That is a pattern. Hare found it repeatedly across the records he examined. Innkeepers were not the bottom of the social hierarchy. They were embedded within its functioning structures at almost every level. Why? How did this happen? The answer gets to something genuinely fascinating about the medieval economy, and it is a story that most history books ignore almost entirely. The medieval inn was not just a place to sleep. It was simultaneously a warehouse, a bank, a transport agency, and an intelligence hub. And the innkeeper was the person who managed all four of those functions at once. Here is how the warehouse function worked. A wool merchant traveling from Bristol to London could not physically transport his entire inventory at one speed on one journey in one go. Some goods would arrive at an inn in bulk, brought in from one direction by one carrier, and the innkeeper's job was to break those large quantities into smaller ones arranged for onward transport and ensure the goods reached their next destination safely. Merchants across Europe built up networks of trusted in specific establishments whose owners they had worked with and found reliable, and they used those networks the way a modern logistics company uses distribution centers. The innkeeper in this arrangement was fronting money. He paid the outgoing carriers himself before receiving reimbursement from the merchant. This meant that to function as a warehouse agent, you had to have substantial capital of your own. You were not, in other words, a poor man taking in wayfaring strangers for pennies. You were a capitalist making operational investments in commercial supply chains. Historians have noted that many successful innkeepers, probably not the romanticized friendly tavern host figure at all, but men who came to the trade already wealthy, had backgrounds as priests, lawyers, or minor nobles. They entered innkeeping because it was lucrative, and the capital requirements meant they could. The cellar of a well-run medieval inn was filled not just with barrels of ale and wine, but with locked strong boxes, heavy iron chests in which merchants could temporarily deposit valuables, documents, coins. The inn functioned as an informal bank at a time when formal banking was still in its early stages, confined largely to Italian merchant families, and before their dissolution in 1312, the Knights Templar. For a merchant on the road, the innkeeper with his locked cellar was the safest place to leave anything valuable overnight. Now, here is where things get even more interesting and honestly a little darker. I want to be careful about how I characterize this because the evidence is suggestive rather than overwhelming. And I think honesty about historical nuance matters. But Byzantine military treatises from the medieval period and similar sources from elsewhere in Europe specifically identify innkeepers as potential intelligence assets. A text known as the Aeneas Tacticus actually includes a specific warning during a siege or emergency. Even innkeepers should not be allowed to receive strangers without permission from civic authorities. The reasoning is revealing. The innkeeper, by the nature of his work, received travelers from everywhere. He heard what they said, observed what they carried, noted where they were headed. He was structurally a collection point for information, the kind of information that military commanders and local lords very much wanted to have. Whether innkeepers were formerly used as informants varied by time and place, but it requires no great stretch of imagination to see how the relationship between innkeeper and local lord could become one of mutual benefit and mutual obligation. The lord provided protection, and a lord's exemption from paying at the inn, which was apparently a common and deeply resented practice, was one form that protection took. The innkeeper in return might be expected to share what he had observed, whose horses had arrived last Tuesday. Where was the merchant from Cologne actually going? Did the man in the corner room seem nervous about something? The inn was not a neutral space. It was always in some sense someone's territory, and the innkeeper was always in some sense watching. This is a dimension of in life that I find both uncomfortable and fascinating in equal measure because it sits alongside the very real warmth and hospitality that the inn also represented. The same man who provided your meal and your fire and your bed. The same man who kept your goods safe in his locked cellar was also potentially someone whose loyalty was partially owed to interests beyond your own comfort. Medieval travelers were aware of this. Word traveled, reputation spread. The network of trusted inns that merchants built up across Europe was not built on optimism. It was built on hard experience, on learning which innkeepers could be relied upon absolutely and which ones required a degree of prudent caution. Now let us talk about what the innkeeper actually did on a daily basis, because the scope of the job is itself remarkable. The working day began before sunrise. The kitchen fire had to be lit, and the cauldron started before the first guests were even awake. The horses in the stable needed feeding and watering. Any guests whose horses had arrived with problems cast shoes. Signs of lameness, equipment damage needed those problems attended to before they could continue their journey. The dining hall needed to be cleaned of the previous night's rushes, or at least supplemented with fresh ones. Supplies needed to be counted and compared against what would be needed for the day's expected guests. Then all day a constant flow of decisions. Who gets which room? The merchant who is paid for privacy, or the lesser traveler who might be bumped? How do you handle the group of returning soldiers who arrive loud and are showing signs of becoming louder? Do you cut off the wine before a situation develops at the cost of the revenue? Or do you let it run and risk something breaking? How do you deal with the guest who claims the bill is wrong? The inn had no formal security system beyond the innkeeper's own judgment, his small staff of guards, if he had them, and his ability to read people accurately. Getting this wrong consistently was how you acquired a bad reputation, and a bad reputation in a world that ran entirely on word of mouth could destroy you. And I want to say something here that I think is often left unsaid when people discuss medieval inns. The innkeeper was also legally responsible for his guests in ways that would surprise a modern hotelier. Under what was called the law of innkeepers' liability, a body of law that developed gradually through the medieval period and varied by region. The innkeeper was responsible for the safety of his guests' property while they were under his roof. If a merchant's goods were stolen while lodged at an inn, the innkeeper could be held liable. This was not a theoretical risk. Cases appear in the historical record. The innkeeper, therefore, had a direct financial incentive to maintain security, to vet his guests at the door, and to keep his establishment in good enough order that valuables were not walking out in the night. The locked cellar was not just a service to his guests. It was protection of his own interests. There were women innkeepers, too, though they are significantly harder to find in the historical record precisely because the sources tend to record them less reliably. Historians estimate that women made up somewhere between 10 and 20% of inn owners, most of them widows who inherited the property after their husbands died. Running a busy medieval inn as a woman was not a retiring life. It required the same financial acumen, the same capacity to manage difficult people, the same web of local relationships and obligations that the male innkeeper maintained. Women who ran inn successfully ran them in exactly the same way, managing the warehouse function, maintaining local political connections, keeping the guards employed and the cellar stocked. The social reality of what these women actually did sits in considerable tension with the way the period is often presented. I keep coming back to a particular thought when I consider the medieval innkeeper, and it is this: We have a habit of imagining the past as a place populated by types rather than individuals. The innkeeper's type is a warm, slightly ridiculous figure in a comedy or a romance. The innkeeper of history was something considerably more complicated, a business person operating at the intersection of hospitality, commerce, law, and local power, managing more competing obligations in a single day than most people today would handle in a week. And he did all of this while knowing with absolute certainty that his guests were judging everything: the food, the fire, the quality of the beds, the behavior of his servants, and that those guests, merchants, pilgrims, royal messengers, would carry that judgment with them down every road they traveled afterward. His reputation was literally traveling ahead of him in all directions at all times. Which brings us to what happened after the day's business settled, when the candles burned low and the hall filled with a kind of noise and life that no amount of careful management could entirely predict or control, or because the inn at night was a different world entirely from the inn at noon, and that world had its own rules, its own cast of characters, and its own capacity to astonish. Close your eyes for just a second, or keep them open. You are the one driving, and imagine that the sun has just gone down. The hall of the inn is different now, not structurally, not physically. The same tables, the same fire, the same low ceiling, but the quality of the room has shifted in the way that rooms always shift when darkness falls, and people have stopped pretending they are going to leave any time soon. The traveling merchant who ate his pottage quietly at noon is now on his third cup of wine, and telling a story about a bridge collapse in Flanders he swears he witnessed himself. A group of men in traveling clothes near the window have pushed their plates aside and produced a set of bone dice that are clicking rhythmically against the wood. From somewhere near the fire, a sound the unmistakable scratch of a stringed instrument being tuned. The evening session at a medieval inn was a world unto itself, and it is a world worth paying close attention to. Let us start with the music, because it tells you something important about the texture of medieval life that no amount of historical description can quite convey on its own. Professional musicians in the medieval period existed on a peculiar social knife edge. Minstrels and troubadours. The terms covered a range of performers from sophisticated court musicians to wandering street entertainers were simultaneously celebrated and mistrusted. They were welcomed in noble courts rewarded by wealthy merchants, applauded in tavern halls, and in the same breath described in certain church texts as disreputable, borderline sinful figures whose trade encouraged idleness and loose behavior. The contradiction did not seem to bother anyone very much. It was too useful and too entertaining to exclude. A minstrel arriving at an inn often paid for his supper and his bed through performance rather than coin. The arrangement was practical and mutually beneficial. The innkeeper got entertainment that kept guests in the hall longer and drinking more, and the minstrel got fed and sheltered without depleting his often very thin traveling funds. It was in its own small way one of the earliest examples of what we would now call a barter economy for creative services. The instruments they brought were as varied as the performers themselves. Harps small enough to carry on a horse or strapped to a back. The violin, early bowed string instrument ancestor to the modern violin which could carry a melody across a crowded, noisy hall. Flutes and pipes, drums and percussion, and the Heragia wheel-driven instrument that produced a droning continuous sound by cranking a handle, which I find endlessly fascinating because it essentially made one person sound like multiple musicians playing simultaneously. Medieval crowds apparently agreed, because the Heragia was enormously popular at exactly the kind of venues, indoor festivals, where you needed sound that could carry over noise. What were they playing? Primarily songs with stories. The chanson de geste, epic narrative poems in Old French, usually about heroic knights and legendary battles, were enormously popular and traveled widely in this oral musical form long before most people could read. A minstrel arriving at an inn in Yorkshire might sing the same story that had been sung the week before in Paris, carrying it the way we now carry music on our phones in his memory and his voice. Love songs, comic songs, political satires. And I want to come back to those in a moment because they matter more than they first appear. The hall lit by its tallow candles, and firelight became something closer to a theater for these hours. And the connection between inn performances and what would eventually become the enclosed theater of the 16th century is not just theoretical. Several theater historians have argued credibly that the courtyard and layout with its raised gallery walkways and central open space was a direct architectural influence on the design of Elizabethan playhouses. Now, the dice gambling in medieval inns and taverns was, to put it plainly, absolutely everywhere. The church objected, authorities periodically banned it. Laws were passed restricting it to certain classes in England. King Henry V actually passed legislation prohibiting apprentices, agricultural workers, and laborers from gambling, which is a particularly entertaining piece of historical irony, given that the same king's own account books record substantial personal losses from his own gambling on tennis, chess, and dice. What Henry V apparently felt was that gambling was fine for the king and problematic for everyone else. The most popular dice game was called hazard, the same word that gives us the modern English word hazard, meaning risk, which tells you something about its reputation. The philosopher and writer John of Salisbury, writing around 1160, described approximately 10 distinct types of dice games being played in his era, suggesting a culture of gambling considerably more varied and sophisticated than the simple image of men rolling bones across a tavern table would suggest. 3 dice were standard. The goal was to achieve specific combinations of results, not simply the highest score, which required at least rudimentary mathematical thinking, and made for games that could be genuinely strategic as well as luck-dependent. The dice themselves were small by modern standards, made from bone, sometimes from ivory in wealthier establishments, with sharp edges rather than the rounded corners we're used to. The record books of medieval cities contain references to cheating with loaded dice that are genuinely sobering. The City Council of Buda in 15th century Hungary specified in their legal code that the punishment for being caught with false dice was to have the die pierce through the palm of the hand of the cheater, a punishment that was both painful and deliberately visible, so that other players would know forever who not to trust at the table. Whether this penalty was ever actually carried out remains unclear, but the fact that they considered it necessary to write it into law suggests that loaded dice were common enough to warrant a formal response. Cards arrived in Europe from the Arab world and Asia in the middle of the 15th century, and within decades they had become the dominant gambling medium, partly because they allowed for a greater variety of games than dice alone, and partly because they could be produced in reasonably standardized form once printing made their manufacture affordable. Until that standardization happened, medieval card games were gloriously chaotic, played with decks that varied by region, using rules that varied by table, with players essentially inventing variants as they went. The moment any particular game was added to the list of officially prohibited activities, resourceful players simply renamed it and carried on. There is a wonderful medieval French story, and I genuinely love this one, in which a minstrel is brought to hell by a demon and left in charge of all the souls there while the demons go out looking for more. St. Peter arrives, challenges the minstrel to a dice game, and wins every soul. The minstrel was supposed to be guarding, leading them all up to heaven. When the demons return to find the place empty, The minstrel is thrown out of hell in disgust and runs all the way to heaven where St. Peter lets him in. The morale, as the story explains it, is why minstrels and gamblers are refused entry to hell when they die. I find something genuinely delightful in a culture that could produce a piece of theology simultaneously about dice games and salvation. But now I want to talk about something in the evening life of the medieval inn that goes considerably deeper than entertainment. Something that in my reading of the historical record strikes me as genuinely important and almost always overlooked. The inn at night was where medieval Europe processed its grievances. Think about what this means in practical terms. You have a hall full of people who have just traveled through the same roads, paid the same tolls, experienced the same weather. They have heard the same rumors about the same tax collector in the same county. They are tired. They are warm. They are slightly drunk. And they are in the company of strangers who have no particular loyalty to the local lord or the royal court. There is no authority figure in this room. There is no priest reminding them of their duties. There is just the fire and each other, and the accumulated grievances of every mile they have ridden. This is where the political satires the minstrels sang become important. Because a minstrel performing a satirical song about corrupt officials or unjust taxation in a packet hall was doing something that had no equivalent in medieval public life. He was giving voice in a form people could repeat and carry with them to exactly the kind of discontent that had nowhere else to go. The hall would laugh or go quiet or murmur, depending on the song and the room and the laughter, or the quiet was itself a kind of political act. The inn was one of very few spaces where people from different backgrounds could speak with relative freedom about what they thought was wrong with the world. And sometimes, what started in a hall at night did not stay in the hall. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The most significant popular uprising in medieval English history was not organized in a council chamber. Historians who have studied its origins carefully point to the networks of ordinary communication that spread its organizing ideas. The traveling preachers, the wandering workers, the people who moved along roads and stopped at inns and talked. The radical priest, John B., whose famous question, "When Adam delve and Eve spawn," who was then the gentleman, became the revolt's rallying cry, was spreading his ideas across exactly this kind of informal network for years before the uprising broke out. The inn was part of that network, not the only part, and not in any simple or direct way, but the habit of gathering in halls and talking, really talking with the loosened tongue that darkness and warmth and company provide, was part of how discontent traveled. The inn also sat at the center of what we might call the medieval rumor economy. In a world without newspapers or public announcements beyond the town crier, the inn was where information accurate and wildly inaccurate circulated at speed. A traveler arriving from the south brought news that the inn guest from yesterday would then carry north. Prices, politics, scandals, disasters, military movements. The historian who coined the phrase oral information network to describe medieval communication was not wrong, and the inn was one of its primary nodes. Rumor could travel faster than a horse in this system, passed from inn to inn, like a relay gaining detail and distortion at each stop. I want to be honest about one more dimension of the evening, in that I've been circling around because it is historical fact, and it belongs in this account. Medieval inns, particularly in cities and on busy trade routes, were also places where women sold companionship. This was not unique to inns. It existed in virtually every setting where men with money and time gathered in the medieval world, and it was regulated, tolerated, formally prohibited, and periodically enforced against, with varying degrees of consistency depending on the city, the era, and the mood of whatever official was theoretically responsible for such things. What is worth noting, because it is so often simplified in both directions, is that women in this position in the medieval period operated within a social and legal landscape of enormous complexity, one that historians are still carefully mapping, and the inn was simply one of the environments in which that landscape played out. The evening wound down slowly, the way evenings in crowded places always do. The fire burned lower. The dice game ended, with someone slightly better off and someone else rather worse off, and both of them would have known this was the probable outcome before they started. The minstrel packed away his instrument and found whatever corner had been designated for his sleep. Travelers who had been talking for hours discovered they were suddenly too tired to continue, and climbed the narrow stairs with their candles, careful of the irregular steps in the dark. And somewhere in that building, in the thin hours of the night while the embers cooled and the dog settled around the hearth, the sleeping world of the inn was quietly completely different from the waking one, because whatever else it was, warehouse, bank, meeting hall, entertainment venue, unofficial parliament of the discontented, the inn was in the end a place where people slept, and medieval sleep was its own particular country, with its own particular inhabitants and its own particular fears, what the night actually felt like from inside those thin walls. That is a story I find myself wanting to tell you now, because it is stranger and more human than almost anything else we have covered yet. There is a question that sounds simple until you actually sit with it, and then it becomes one of the most interesting questions in all of medieval history. Who exactly could afford to stay at an inn? We have spent several parts of this story inside the inn. The food, the fire, the sleep, the music, the innkeeper's extraordinary power. But I've been deliberately holding back a harder truth because the medieval inn, for all its warmth and vitality, was not a democratic institution. It was not open to everyone. And understanding who was left outside tells you something essential about how medieval society actually worked. Let us talk numbers because they matter. In 14th century England, the period our story has largely inhabited a common bed in a shared chamber at a town and cost roughly 1 to 3 pennies per night. A simple meal of pottage and bread added another 1 to 4 pennies. Stabling your horse, which was non-negotiable if you had one, cost an additional 2 to 6 pennies. A full day's expenses at a modest in-bed meals horse came to somewhere between 3 and 8 pennies total, with the higher end reflecting the cost in a large city or along a busy pilgrimage route. Now, here is what makes those numbers significant. An unskilled laborer in the same period earned roughly 2 to 4 pennies a day. A full day of hard physical work, digging ditches, carrying stones, hauling goods, earned you just barely enough to cover one night at the cheapest inn with nothing left for the next day. If you were a craftsman, a skilled tradesman, or a merchant, you earned considerably more and the inn was genuinely affordable. But if you were at the bottom of the wage scale, the inn was not an option. It was simply not accessible. Many inns in England actually had an informal but widely observed rule. If you arrived on foot without a horse, you might be turned away at the door. Not out of cruelty exactly, but out of practical calculation. A horse was collateral of a sort, evidence that you had assets and could pay. Arriving on foot, unless you were a recognized pilgrim with clear church credentials, marked you as someone who probably could not. The doorstep of the inn was itself a kind of economic filter that sorted medieval travelers before they even asked for a room. So what did the poor traveler do? What did the person on foot with 3 pennies to their name do when darkness fell and the road became unsafe? The answers are more varied and more humanly interesting than the simple answer of "they went without" would suggest. The ale house, that informal brewing operation we met early in this story, sometimes offered a corner on the floor and a piece of bread for a fraction of what the inn charged. Not a bed, not stabling, not a meal, just physical shelter from the dark and the cold. The rope and bench arrangement we mentioned earlier, where travelers paid a halfpenny to lean their arms over a horizontal rope strung at chest height, was the very bottom tier of this economy, a form of accommodation so minimal it barely deserves the name. And yet for someone with nothing else, it was everything. Monasteries continued to provide free or nominal cost lodging throughout the medieval period, especially on established pilgrimage routes. The guest houses attached to abbayas and priories were not, as some people imagine, the equivalent of five-star hotels. They were typically Spartan rule-goed and offered limited privacy, but they were free. They were generally safe, and they came with meals and the spiritual credibility that a church institution provided. For a poor pilgrim traveling to Canterbury or to Rome, the network of monastic guest houses was quite literally what made the journey possible. There was also a third system that most people today know nothing about, and which I find genuinely touching in what it reveals about medieval attitudes toward communal obligation. From the 13th century onward, many English and French towns established what were called pilgrim hospitals or hospices, charitable institutions, often funded by wealthy donors or guilds, specifically designed to provide free lodging to poor travelers and pilgrims for a limited number of nights. Not hospitals in the modern medical sense. Hospices in the old meaning of the word, places of hospitality. You could stay for 3 nights typically. You would receive a bed such as it was a meal, and usually some form of spiritual care or prayer. Then you had to move on, making room for the next arrival. The existence of these institutions tells you something that the inn itself cannot tell you. That medieval society recognized, at least in its charitable and religious impulses, that the road would be traveled by people who had nothing, and that some provision for those people was a moral responsibility. The wealthy merchant who slept in a private room at the Georgian in Salisbury, and the penniless pilgrim sleeping on a pallet at the Hospital of St. Julian, were separated by economics that were impossible to bridge, but they existed within a single system that in its better moments acknowledged both of them. Now, there is a subject I've been building toward, and I want to spend some time here because it is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things I've ever encountered in reading about the medieval period. It concerns what happened inside the inn when the candles burned down to stubs, and the last guests climbed those narrow stairs and pulled their thin blankets up over themselves in the dark. Because medieval people did not sleep the way you sleep, not even close. The historian Roger E. Kirsch spent decades, literally decades, combing through diaries, medical texts, legal records, court depositions, novels, letters, ballads, and poems from pre-industrial Europe. And what he found was a pattern so consistent and so surprising that it rewrote our understanding of human sleep history. His book, published in 2001, drew together more than 500 original references. By the time of his more recent work, he had found over 2,000. The finding before the industrial era, most people in Western Europe did not sleep in a single continuous block of 8 hours. They slept in 2 distinct phases, a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by a period of wakefulness lasting roughly 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night. This pattern had names in multiple languages. In French, it was the premier somme and the second somme. In Italian, primo sonno. In Latin, it appears as primus somnus, going back all the way to ancient writers. Virgil uses the phrase in the Aeneid, composed in the 1st century of the Old Era, describing the hour when the first sleep terminates. Geoffrey Chaucer mentions it casually in the Canterbury Tales, as if it were something every reader would immediately recognize. It was not a curiosity or a disorder. It was simply the way sleep worked before artificial lighting reshaped the night. A typical night during the medieval period, as the evidence suggests, would begin shortly after sunset, around 8 or 9 in the evening, depending on the season. First sleep would carry most people through to somewhere around midnight or 1-ish in the morning. Then they would naturally wake. And here is where it gets really interesting, because what people did in that interval between the two sleeps is a window into a medieval inner life that is almost completely invisible in the conventional histories. Some people prayed. The medieval night was religiously structured in ways that our secular sleep is not, and waking in the dark was considered an appropriate time for reflection, confession of private sins to God, and petition. The hour between first and second sleep was described by at least one medieval physician as the best time for serious thinking, when the mind was clear of the day's distractions, but not yet clouded by fatigue. Some people got up and did small tasks, tended to a sick child, checked on animals, completed work by candlelight that the day had not allowed. Some people talked to whoever was sharing their bed or their chamber. In a world without privacy and without solitude, the hour between sleeps was one of the few genuinely intimate moments available, the darkness creating a kind of privacy that the communal sleeping arrangements of the medieval world otherwise denied. Now, imagine this pattern playing out in the specific context of the inn, a room with 8 straw beds, 4 or 5 strangers pressed together in the darkness. The fire downstairs is burned low. The minstrel packed away his instrument hours ago. The dice game is long finished. Outside, the town is completely dark. There is no street lighting, no ambient glow from other buildings, nothing. Just profound, total darkness and the sounds of other people breathing. Somewhere around midnight, several of these sleepers will naturally wake. Not in distress, not because something has gone wrong, just because this is when the body wakes. In a private home, the waking person might lie, quietly pray, perhaps light a candle, and read if they were wealthy enough to have books. But in a shared room at an inn, the historical record suggests that the interval between sleeps in communal settings was often social. People talked quietly in the dark in voices that stayed low, out of consideration for those still sleeping. Travelers who had been strangers at dinner, who had passed each other cautiously in the hall, found themselves in the particular intimacy of a shared waking in the middle of the night, when all the social armor had dissolved, and there was nothing to do but be human together in the dark. I find it genuinely moving that some of the most honest conversations in medieval Europe probably happened between strangers in chambers in the hour between their first and second sleep, when no one could quite see anyone else's face, and the road's exhaustion had stripped away every pretense. Now, there is a caveat I want to be honest with you about, because intellectual honesty matters to me, and I think it matters to you too if you're still here at Part 7. Eckert's biphasic sleep theory, while widely cited and genuinely well supported by historical evidence, is not without academic debate. Some historians have argued that the references to first and second sleep in medieval sources may simply describe phases within a single continuous night's sleep, rather than 2 distinct sleep episodes separated by wakefulness. Others point out that the pattern, even if real, was probably not universal. Medieval monks, for instance, followed a completely different sleep schedule, going to bed around 7 hot in the evening and rising for matins prayers around 2 hot in the morning with no interval built in between. Children were advised to sleep consecutively for 9 to 10 hours. Regional and seasonal variation would have produced enormous diversity. What is not in dispute is that the medieval experience of night was fundamentally different from ours in ways that go well beyond the absence of electric lights. The darkness was complete in a way that most people living in cities today have never experienced. Sound traveled differently. The cold could be serious and even dangerous, particularly in winter in a building with no central heating. Fear of fire, of thieves, of spiritual dangers that medieval Christianity described with great specificity was a genuine presence in the nighttime consciousness of medieval people. One historian compiled a list of the specific threats that medieval sleepers at inns said worrying about. Bed bugs obviously were an established fact rather than a fear. Fire was a catastrophic possibility in a timber-framed building lit with open flames and packed with straw bedding. Thieves were a real risk, and the records of innkeeper liability show enough actual theft that travelers had genuine reason for concern. But some of the fears were more metaphysical. The devil was understood to be specifically active at night, preying on the sleeping in ways that daylight prevented. Sleep itself was described in some medieval medical texts as a kind of small death, a surrender of consciousness that left you vulnerable in ways that wakefulness did not. And yet, for all that, the fear and the cold, and the bed bugs, and the theological anxiety about what the darkness harbored, the inn remained night after night a place people came to willingly, a place they were grateful to reach, because the alternative was the road at night, and the road at night was genuinely worse, which is exactly the tension at the heart of the inn's meaning in medieval life. It was imperfect, occasionally dangerous, definitely uncomfortable by any modern standard, and yet it was the best available answer to the darkness. The warmth it offered was not ideal. It was simply warmer than outside. And when I think about that, when I really sit with the image of a dozen strangers lying in the dark in a 14th century inn, half of them awake in the middle of the night, talking quietly, in the way people only talk when the world has gone very small, I feel something that I do not quite have the right word for. Not nostalgia exactly, more like recognition. The recognition that what those people needed was what people have always needed. Company warmth, and the knowledge that they would make it through to morning. They did, almost always they did. And what waited for them on the other side of the night, the prices they paid, the economies that made the impossible or impossible, the people who profited, and the people who are turned away at the door, that is a story with a darkness of its own. One we're going to look at directly now. Most of the time, the inn was exactly what it appeared to be, a place of genuine, if imperfect, shelter and hospitality. An innkeeper who ran a clean house, served honest food, kept the cellar stocked, and maintained the kind of reputation that drew merchants back, year after year, was doing well for himself and providing real value to the travelers who passed through. But I want to tell you about the other kind, because the medieval inn had a dark side that was serious enough and documented enough that it shaped the entire legal history of hospitality law, produced some of the most extraordinary court cases in the medieval record, and gave rise to a body of law that still has direct descendants in the hotel regulations of the modern world. And it all comes down to a very simple problem. The traveler at an inn was extraordinarily vulnerable, and not everyone who ran an inn was the trustworthy sort that most travelers hoped for. Let me paint you the picture. You arrive at an inn alone after dark in an unfamiliar town. You are carrying coin because you have no other way to pay for anything on the road. You may be carrying goods, cloth samples, spices, official documents, correspondence for someone important. You do not know the innkeeper. You do not know any of the other guests. You're tired. You're slightly disoriented. And you have come in from a road where you are already aware of danger. The door locks behind you with whatever latch the innkeeper provides. Whatever you have brought with you is now inside this building, in the care of a stranger, in a room you will share with other strangers. The medieval traveler placed an extraordinary degree of trust in the inn simply by walking through its door, and in most cases, that trust was honored. Most innkeepers were legitimate business people whose entire livelihood depended on their reputation. And in a world where reputation traveled entirely by word of mouth, a single serious incident could destroy an establishment for years. The networks of trusted inns that merchants built up across Europe, specific houses they had used before and vouched for among their colleagues, were built on accumulated experience over time, not on blind faith. But the records are also full of the exceptions. Medieval court documents, coroner's rolls, and town records contain accounts of inns that were anything but safe. The most common complaint, appearing repeatedly across different regions and time periods, was straightforward theft. A merchant would arrive sleep and wake to find that his pack had been opened. Coins were missing, sometimes goods. Sometimes a horse had been exchanged for a lesser animal overnight, the original having quietly disappeared from the stable while the traveler slept. The thieves were sometimes fellow guests, sometimes servants of the inn, and sometimes in cases that the records describe with a kind of grim out-of-factness, the innkeeper himself. The evidence suggests that some innkeepers maintained what we might politely call informal arrangements with local criminals. A traveler with evident wealth would arrive, be welcomed, be fed, and given a room. Information about what the traveler was carrying, how much coin, what goods, which direction they were heading in the morning would be passed quietly to associates. The traveler would leave in the morning and several miles down the road encounter what appeared to be a chance robbery, except that it was not chance at all. The inn had been the first act in a well-organized scheme. The traveler who made it home and reported what had happened rarely had any way to prove the connection. The innkeeper could express sympathy and complete ignorance with equal credibility. There is an account from the town records of a southern English county that describes a woman innkeeper who opened a small sliding panel in her main door when a drunk guest came back late and banged on it, demanding more wine, after the inn had closed for the night. She told him to go sleep it off. He responded by putting a hatchet through the door. The case ended up in court, where the question was whether this constituted assault against the innkeeper. What strikes me about this incident is not the violence of the drunk, which is unfortunately unremarkable in any era. It is the detail of the sliding panel in the door, a feature that clearly existed specifically because the innkeeper needed a way to see and speak to late arrivals without opening the door fully to them. This was not an inn operating in a world of naive, open hospitality. This was an inn with defenses built into its architecture because experience had taught its proprietor that the door was a point of vulnerability. The legal response to the genuine dangers travelers faced is one of the most interesting aspects of the entire inn story, and it is worth spending some time on because it connects directly to the laws that govern hotels and lodging even today. Somewhere in the 14th and 15th centuries, the legal historians are not in precise agreement on when English common law began to develop what became known as the innkeeper liability doctrine. The principle was deceptively simple. If a guest property was stolen or damaged while under the innkeeper's roof, the innkeeper was responsible for the loss, regardless of whether he was personally at fault. The guest did not need to prove negligence. The guest did not need to identify the thief. The mere fact that the property had been in the inn and was now gone was enough to trigger the innkeeper's liability. This was extraordinary. It was, and still is, considered one of the strictest liability doctrines in all of English common law. Stricter than most contracts, stricter than most ordinary tort law. The innkeeper under this doctrine was essentially an insurer of his guest's property. He was responsible for theft by his servants, by other guests, by strangers who had found their way in, by unknown parties whose entry could not be explained. The only exceptions were if the loss was caused by God, a flood, a lightning strike, that kind of thing, or by the king's enemies in a time of war. Everything else was the innkeeper's problem. Why was the law this strict? The legal historians who have analyzed this doctrine point to exactly the vulnerability we described earlier. The traveler had no choice but to trust the innkeeper. He could not guard his goods himself in a shared room full of strangers. He could not take his horse to bed with him. He could not stay awake all night watching his pack. He had surrendered a degree of control that ordinary contracts did not require, and the law recognized this surrender by imposing a correspondingly extraordinary duty of care on the person who received it. There was also a darker reason which the earliest English legal sources state quite directly. The innkeeper was, in their words, held somewhat suspect, not because most innkeepers were criminals. The sources are careful to acknowledge that most were honest, but because the position of innkeeper created a structural opportunity for deception and collusion that the ordinary law of contracts was inadequate to address. Making the innkeeper absolutely liable was the legal system's way of ensuring he had every possible incentive to prevent anything from going wrong, including making sure that the people he let through his door and the people he had employed were not the kind of people who would take advantage of the guests sleeping upstairs. The innkeeper's lien, the legal right to hold a guest's goods until the bill was paid, was the corresponding protection that the law gave innkeepers in return for this enormous liability. If a guest refused to pay, or if the innkeeper had reason to believe payment would be refused, he could legally detain the guest's property. He could not imprison the guest, but he could keep the horse. He could keep the bags. Some records describe cases where inns were owed so much in unpaid bills, sometimes by noblemen who had simply assumed that their rank exempted them from mundane commercial obligations, that the innkeeper was left holding goods of real value with no clear legal mechanism to recover his money. There is a wonderful phrase that appears in some English legal records of the period about horses that had been left unpaid at once for too long. The phrase was that the horse had eaten out the price of his head, meaning the cost of feeding and stabling the animal had now exceeded its market value, and the innkeeper was stuck with both the debt and the animal. Even the legal records of the medieval period have moments of black comedy if you look for them. Now, I want to tell you about a specific category of bad, in that I find genuinely fascinating, not just because of its obvious dramatic qualities, but because of what it reveals about the geography of danger in the medieval world. The records describe in multiple sources across multiple countries a pattern of establishment that existed specifically at the margins of the regular inn network. These were the inns that sat off the main roads, not centrally located in market towns where passing traffic and community oversight kept behavior relatively constrained, but placed in more isolated positions where travelers might find themselves without alternatives when darkness fell. Places that had developed either by design or by drift, a clientele that included highwaymen, press gangs, and others who had reasons to avoid the kind of respectable inn where an innkeeper who also served as town bailiff might be paying close attention. The mechanism was often described as misdirection. Travelers unfamiliar with a town or region would be sent by someone apparently helpful, perhaps a local encountered on the road to one of these establishments, rather than to the reputable inn they were seeking. The local was paid for the referral. The traveler would arrive, be accommodated, and then find themselves in a situation that deteriorated in various ways. Sometimes it was simple robbery during the night. Sometimes it was gambling that became coercive. In the most extreme cases that appear in the records, travelers simply disappeared from these establishments without any subsequent account of where they had gone. I want to be precise about this. Cases of travelers being deliberately harmed at inns were not the norm, and the sources that describe them are explicit that most inns were not this kind of place. But the fact that enough of these establishments existed and were known to exist to generate consistent descriptions across multiple independent sources tells you something important about the landscape of risk that medieval travel involved. The reputation of a good inn was valuable precisely because it distinguished itself from the alternatives. When merchants circulated information among themselves about which inns trust they were doing so in a world that contained genuinely untrustworthy ones. There is a detail from the 14th century English legal record that stays with me more than almost anything else in this entire story. It comes from a case in which the court had to consider whether an innkeeper could be held responsible for the property of a guest who had died on the premises, whether death transferred the liability or ended it. The case is legally dry, and the outcome is not particularly dramatic. But the existence of the case tells you something. Guests were dying at Ions with enough regularity that the legal system found it necessary to specify what happened to their belongings afterward. In a world without hospitals, without reliable medical care, without any guarantee of surviving a serious illness or injury encountered on the road, the inn was also the last place many travelers ever occupied. The stranger who had arrived coughing or injured from a fall, or simply old and worn out by a life on the road, they sometimes did not leave. And when they died in an inn room, the question of what happened to what they had brought with them became urgently practical. The law said the innkeeper held their goods in trust until the proper heirs could be identified and contacted. The practical reality in many cases was that the innkeeper was the only person who knew the traveler had existed at all. In a world without identification, documents without any central registry, the dead stranger at the inn was someone whose entire history was whatever he had told the innkeeper over dinner, which might have been entirely true, or might have been almost entirely invented. The medieval traveler had a freedom of reinvention that the modern world with its databases and phone records and electronic traces has largely eliminated. You could be anyone on the road. You could tell any story, and when you were gone, the story went with you. There is something simultaneously melancholy and strangely liberating in that thought. The inn as the last place, the innkeeper as the final witness, the road as the thing that both connected and erased. And yet, for most travelers, most of the time, the inn was not a place of danger or mystery or legal tragedy. It was simply what it had always been: a room, a fire, a meal, other people. The place where the road stopped for the night and something close to ordinary life briefly resumed. Understanding what that ordinary life looked like in its fullest context, the church behind it, the pilgrims moving through it, the sacred economy that ran alongside the commercial one, that is a world we've not yet fully entered. And it changes everything about how the inn felt from the inside. There is a sentence written in Latin in the 6th century that I keep returning to because it says something about the medieval world, and honestly about the human world, that no amount of historical analysis quite captures the way a single line can. It comes from the rule of Saint Benedict, the document that governed life in Benedictine monasteries across Europe for more than 1,000 years. And it says simply this: receive every guest as if you were receiving Christ himself, not as if the guest were important, not as if the guest deserved consideration because of their rank or their wealth or what they could offer you in return, as if they were Christ. Because the rule explains when the day of judgment comes, Christ himself will say, I was a stranger and you welcome me. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think we lose something important when we reduce medieval hospitality to its commercial dimensions, the prices, the sleeping arrangements, the legal liability of innkeepers. All of that is real and worth knowing. But running beneath all of it, shaping it, arguing with it, sometimes transforming it into something genuinely extraordinary, was this other thing a theological conviction that the stranger at your door was not just a stranger, that the act of welcoming the unknown traveler was in some deep and literal sense an act of sacred significance. This was not a marginal position. This was for 1,000 years one of the organizing principles of European civilization. And you cannot understand the medieval inn without understanding what it existed alongside, and sometimes in tension with which was this parallel sacred economy of hospitality, freely given, No coin required, tied to salvation. Let us talk about what the monastery actually offered the traveler, because the reality was both more beautiful and considerably more complicated than the simple image of an open gate and a warm welcome suggests. The Benedictine rule was explicit about the mechanism of hospitality. When a guest arrived, they were not simply shown to a room. There was a protocol. A senior monk, sometimes the abbot himself, came to meet the arriving guest. There was a prayer together. There was in the prescriptions of the rule a washing of hands and feet, an act that deliberately recalled the moment in the Gospels where Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. This was not symbolic in a decorative sense. It was meant to be physically performed, and historical records suggest it was at least for honored guests, and especially for pilgrims and the poor who, according to the rule, were to receive the most particular attention precisely because they most resembled Christ in his earthly poverty. The monastery maintained a dedicated guest house, physically separate from the monastic buildings where the monks themselves lived, worked, and prayed. This separation was important. The guest hall was a liminal space belonging to neither the sacred enclosure of the monks nor the profane world of the road. It was the place where those two worlds met and briefly shared warmth, food, and prayer. And the food that came from the monastery's kitchen to the guest hall was by the standards of medieval hospitality genuinely good. Historical accounts from several major English Benedictine houses, Worcester Cathedral Priory, Reading Abbey, Bury St. Edmunds, describe kitchens sending beef eggs, salted fish bread, and ale to guests with a regularity that suggests real institutional commitment rather than reluctant charity. At Kirkstall Abbey near Leeds, a Cistercian house, the guest houses had piped water, a facility that was genuinely rare in the 12th century, remarkable enough that historians specifically note it. But here is the part that I find most revealing and most humanly honest. The monasteries were being crushed by this obligation. The Cluny Priory at Bermany, located just off the main London to Dew Road, one of the busiest travel corridors in England, was in perpetual financial difficulty, partly because so many travelers stopped there that the cost of feeding them exceeded what the monastery could sustainably bear. Reading Abbey found itself in debt. Worcester Cathedral Priory, at various points, had to appeal to the Bishop of Worcester for additional resources, specifically to fund its hospitality obligations. In 1314, the bishop responded by allowing the priory to appropriate the income from a parish church, essentially redirecting church revenue from a village toward the feeding of travelers at the abbey. Think about what this means. A monastery was so committed to welcoming strangers that it went into debt doing so, and the institutional response was not to stop welcoming strangers, but to find new sources of money to continue. This is the point where the theology and the economics of medieval hospitality become genuinely inseparable. The monk who followed the rule and welcomed every guest as Christ had made a commitment that was by any rational financial calculation costly. The monastery absorbed that cost because it understood the act of hospitality not as charity. In the modern sense, of voluntary kindness extended from abundance, but as a sacred obligation that existed regardless of whether there was abundance to support it. There was, however, a practical limit that had to be applied eventually, the 3-day rule. You could stay at a monastery guest house for 3 days. You would be fed, housed, cared for, all of it freely, with no expectation of payment. On the 3rd day after the midday meal, the guest was expected to take their leave and continue their journey. If they needed to stay longer for reasons of genuine illness or hardship, an exception could be arranged with the guestmaster. But the default was 3 days, and the expectation that you would move on was understood and accepted. The Franciscans were even stricter. 2 days and 2 nights was the standard, and a guest who wanted to stay beyond that had to present themselves to the community chapter essentially a formal meeting of the monks and make a public request. There was a humility built into this requirement that seems intentional. You could not just quietly overstay. You had to ask visibly in front of the whole community. Now, I want to take you somewhere specific because no discussion of medieval hospitality and the pilgrimage road is complete without talking about the most extraordinary road in all of medieval Europe, the road that made more inns necessary than any other single factor that built entire towns and shaped entire economies, that drew 250,000 pilgrims a year at its peak, and that told its travelers before they even set out to make their wills because you might not come back. The Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James. The story behind it begins with a hermit named Pelio, living in the forests of what is now northwestern Spain in the early 9th century, who reportedly saw lights flickering in the darkness of the woods at night, and following them discovered a tomb. The local bishop examined the site and declared it to contain the remains of St. James the Greater, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, whose body was believed to have been transported to Spain after his execution in Jerusalem in the year 44 of the Common Era. King Alonso II of Asturias traveled immediately from his court to visit the site and ordered a church built there. That church, expanded and rebuilt over centuries, became the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, and the road to it became the spine of medieval Europe. By the 12th century, the flow of pilgrims was so large that a monk named Amarish Picord compiled what is now known as the Codex Calstinus, essentially the world's first travel guidebook, written around 1140. It told pilgrims which routes to follow, which towns had reliable food and water, which passes in the Pyrenees were safe in which seasons, which rivers to ford carefully. It described the peoples of different regions along the route, sometimes with the kind of frank, cultural generalizations that would raise eyebrows today, and it listed the hospices and hospitals where pilgrims could seek shelter. It was a document produced not just for spiritual guidance, but for survival. The word hospital, that appears again and again in the medieval Camino records, requires a brief explanation because it does not mean what we think it means. The word comes from the Latin hospice, meaning guest or stranger, the same root that gives us hospitality. Hospice, hostel, and hotel. In medieval usage, a hospital along a pilgrimage route was primarily a place of hospitality for travelers, shelter, food, and basic care for the weary. Medical treatment was offered when needed and possible, but the fundamental function was the older, broader one. You were a guest, you were housed. The fact that you might be sick was one version of need among many. The network of these hospices along the Camino was extraordinary in its geographic reach and its organizational ambition. At the high alpine pass of the Great St. Bernard, the crossing of the Alps on the route from northern Europe toward Rome and toward Spain, a community of canons regularly established and maintained a hospital that received donations from across the continent, specifically to ensure that pilgrims could cross the Alps safely regardless of weather or season. Warm clothes were provided. Food and fire were guaranteed. The community up there had committed institutionally and spiritually to maintaining this service in one of the most inhospitable places in Europe, at considerable ongoing cost because the pilgrims kept coming and someone had to be there for them. On the Spanish side of the Pyrenees at the pass of Roncesvalles, another hospital complex emerged and was maintained for centuries. Along the route through northern Spain, what became known as the Camino Francis, the French Way towns grew up specifically around the needs of pilgrims. The town of Hospital de Bigot still carries in its name the hospital that was once its reason for existing. These were not towns that happened to have hospitals. They were hospitals that became towns. I find it genuinely moving thinking about the infrastructure that medieval Europe built for people walking towards something they believed in deeply enough to risk their lives for it. Because the pilgrims who walked the Camino to Santiago were not on a tourist holiday. They were often walking because they had sinned, sometimes grievously, and believed that the journey and the arrival at the saint's tomb could offer a chance at forgiveness that ordinary life could not. They were walking because they were ill, or because someone they loved was ill, and they had come to ask the saint for a miracle that medicine could not provide. They were walking because they had made a vow sometimes, in the desperation of a crisis, sometimes in the calm of long deliberation, and the keeping of the vow was itself the point. Some of them died on the road. The church actually encouraged pilgrims to make their wills before departing as a practical acknowledgement of this reality. Some arrived at Santiago having walked for months, their shoes worn through their bodies, damaged by the Pyrenean passes and the Spanish plateau and the wolves and the bandits and the sheer relentless miles. And when they finally put their hands on the stone pillar just inside the great cathedral door, a pillar worn visibly smooth by the hands of millions who came before and after the journey was complete. What I find interesting is the way this sacred economy of pilgrimage ran alongside and through the commercial economy of inns. The pilgrims who walked the Camino needed beds and food just as the wool merchants did. The towns along the route built inns to serve them, and those inns charged real money, and pilgrims with no money were directed to the hospices. The hospices offered free shelter for 3 days, and then sent the pilgrim onward renewed. But here is the thing about walking the Camino in the medieval period. It distinguishes it from almost any other form of travel in the era on the Camino. The pilgrim was protected by a specific legal and spiritual status. Attacking a pilgrim was not merely a crime, it was a sacrilege. It was a violation of a person who traveled under the protection of the church itself. 7th century Anglo-Saxon law had already stated that a stranger who made himself known was to be protected by the king and the bishop, as if they were his personal kinsmen. On the pilgrimage roads, this protection was formalized, maintained, and taken seriously. The pilgrim identity was also marked physically, visibly in a way that the ordinary traveler's was not. The scallop shell, the staff, the distinctive bag, the pilgrim's certificate. These were not decorative accessories. They were social signals understood by every person you encountered on the road that announced, "I am walking towards something sacred. I am in a protected state." The social contract of the road applies to me with particular force. I think about this, the visible declared identity of the medieval pilgrim, when I consider how anonymous and invisible most modern movement is. You can travel across continents without anyone knowing why you are going or what it means to you. The medieval pilgrim wore their purpose on their body. It was legible. It invited and to some degree required a particular kind of response from everyone they encountered. The monk who washed their feet, the innkeeper who gave them a bed, the stranger who shared their fire. That visible declaration of purpose, I am going somewhere that matters. I am carrying something I believe in, changed the quality of every interaction along the road. And the road itself, from the monastery guest house to the commercial inn to the pilgrim hospice, responded to it. The entire system, commercial and sacred, organized and improvised, ancient and continuously reinvented, was not just transportation infrastructure. It was a form of civilization, one that understood at its best that the stranger on the road was not someone to fear or ignore or merely extract money from. They were someone arriving, someone who had come from somewhere and was going somewhere, someone who for one night at least needed exactly what the inn and the guest house and the hospice had to offer: something to eat, somewhere to rest, the basic, unremarkable miracle of being received. And from that simple transaction, that ancient universal exchange between the one who arrives and the one who opens the door, something remarkable was built. Not just the inns and the roads, the world that connected them. which is exactly where we are headed next, toward the moment when this world began to be formally governed, regulated, and held to a standard. Because when the church and the law started trying to ensure that the inn was a trustworthy place, the results were stranger and more fascinating than either intended. Somewhere around the year 1266, the government of medieval England did something quietly extraordinary. It passed a law not about war, not about land, not about taxation, which is what medieval legislation usually concerned itself with. It passed a law about bread nail, about whether the loaf you bought from the baker was the right weight, about whether the cup of ale the innkeeper poured was honestly measured, about whether you, the ordinary person moving through the markets and inns and ale houses of medieval England, were being cheated on the most basic transactions of daily life. The A size of bread and nail issued in approximately the 51st year of King Henry III's reign is one of those historical documents that sounds dull until you start reading it, at which point it becomes one of the most revealing things I have ever encountered about how a medieval society understood the relationship between the state, the market, and ordinary people. Its principle was simple and actually rather elegant. The price of a loaf of bread would be fixed, not the weight, the price. When the price of wheat went up, the loaf got smaller. When wheat was cheap and plentiful, the loaf got bigger. The farthing you paid was always a farthing, but what you got for that farthing changed with the harvest. This system meant that ordinary buyers always knew what they were spending. While bakers could adjust their product to reflect genuine costs, it was a medieval sliding scale, and it worked. The law remained essentially in force with modifications until the early 19th century, nearly 600 years. That is a piece of legislation that outlasted every empire in the medieval world. The L portion of the assai worked similarly. When a quarter of wheat was sold at 3 shillings and barley at 20, brewers in cities could afford to sell 2 gall of ale for a penny. Outside cities where costs were lower, 3 gallons for a penny. The math was spelled out. The relationship between grain prices and drink prices was encoded in law, and the expectation was that the numbers would be followed. Now, here is the part that I find genuinely fascinating. Not the law itself, but the mechanism that was supposed to enforce it. Local authorities appointed specific officials called the Gusta Torres Cavalier. In English, these were known as ale conners, or ale tasters. Their job, which they took up annually after being sworn in at the court of their manor, was to go around to every place that sold ale in their jurisdiction, taste it, and assess whether it met the standard. They were checking quality, checking price, checking measure. And if the ale was watered down or short poured, or if it tasted wrong, the brewer or innkeeper faced consequences. I want you to sit with the image of the medieval ale taster for just a moment, because it is one of those historical roles that sounds like something invented for comedy, but was entirely real and genuinely important. This was a public official whose job description included drinking ale as a professional responsibility. The records show them doing exactly that, going from establishment to establishment, and the fines levied on brewers who failed. The tasting are scattered through local court rolls across England for several hundred years. The punishment for cheating on bread or ale could be dramatic. A baker in London named William Chester, found to have sold underweight loaves, was placed on a hurdle, essentially a flat wooden frame, and dragged through the streets from the Guildhall through the neighborhood of Cheap to Temple Bar, ensuring that as many of his fellow bakers as possible witnessed his humiliation. Another baker, Richard Hayne, who'd been caught adulterating his bread with sand, was transported to Newgate Prison in the same manner, with the offending loaves carried on a lance in front of him, so that everyone they passed knew exactly what he had done. The logic behind these public humiliations was not simply punitive, it was reputational. In a world without food, safety inspectors, without labeling requirements, without any of the transparent information systems we take for granted today. The only real protection a buyer had was the seller's known reputation. Making the consequences of cheating publicly visible was the medieval equivalent of a one-star review that every potential customer could see. You could not hide behind anonymity. Your failure was announced in the streets you worked in by the very people who should have trusted you. And this connects to something larger about how medieval commercial life actually functioned. Something that helps explain why the inn specifically occupied such a peculiar and important position in a medieval society. The medieval economy ran almost entirely on personal reputation and personal relationship. There were no consumer protection agencies. There were no standardized contracts enforced by impersonal courts in any consistent way. There was the size of bread nail, and there were guild regulations, and there were local bylaws in specific towns, but the actual day-to-day protection against being cheated came primarily from two things: your own knowledge of who could be trusted, and your ability to tell other people what you found out. This is why the inn mattered so profoundly as an information node. In part 2 of this story, we talked about how travelers carried road information forward, which bridges were out, which routes were safe. But the same principle applied to commercial reputation. The merchant who had been cheated at a specific inn in Coventry would mention it to every merchant he encountered for the next year. The pilgrim who had found the hostel at such and such a monastery particularly welcoming would tell everyone heading in that direction. The inn was not just a place where people stopped. It was a place where assessments were made and shared, where the collective knowledge of the traveling world accumulated story by story, experience by experience, into something like a distributed reputation system. Now, I want to take you to a specific moment, a specific inn, a specific evening, a specific encounter that I think crystallizes everything we have been talking about across these 9 previous parts. And I want to take you there through the eyes of the person who best understood what the medieval inn was, Geoffrey Chaucer, sometime in the 1380s. Chaucer was not a poet who wrote about things he imagined. He was a civil servant controller of customs at the port of London, a position that put him in constant contact with merchants, sailors, and travelers from across Europe who wrote about things he had seen. And when he decided to write his masterpiece, the collection we know as the Canterbury Tales, he did not begin it in a cathedral. He did not begin it on the road. He began it in an inn, the Tabard in Sadok, the south bank of the Timpames, just beyond the legal jurisdiction of the city of London. The Tabard was a real inn. It was established in 1307, originally built for the Abbot of Hyde in Winchester, who needed a place for himself and his brethren to stay when their ecclesiastical business brought them to London. It stood at the precise point where the 2 ancient Roman roads, Stane Street and Watling Street, merged before crossing London Bridge into the city. Every traveler coming from the Channel ports from Canterbury from the south of England had to pass through or near the Tabard. Its location was not accidental. It was one of the most strategically placed buildings in medieval England, and it knew it. Suk in the 1380s was a place that existed in a peculiar state of moral and legal ambiguity. The manor of Suk was controlled by the bishops of Winchester, and it fell outside the direct jurisdiction of the city of London. This meant that activities forbidden within the city walls were permitted in south. The entertainment district of medieval London was not inside London. It was just across the river in that strip of buildings between the bridge and the open fields, theaters, and bear baiting rings and brothel, the workers of which were colloquially known, with what I can only call medieval montwit, as the Winchester geese, owing to their employment within the bishop's territory, and the inns that served everyone passing through the Tabard, according to its historical records, was filled with pilgrims, merchants, travelers on legal business. And let us not be naive about this. A considerable population of people whose purposes were considerably less holy. That was precisely what made it true in the full medieval sense. It did not sort its guests by virtue. It received them all. And it is here on one evening in the spring. Chaucer places it deliberately in April when the cold is broken, and the roads have dried, and pilgrims historically begin to move, that the narrator of the Canterbury Tales finds himself already staying at the Tabard, ready to set out for Canterbury the next morning. He arrives to find 29 other travelers also assembled, all of them planning the same journey. What Chaucer does with those 29 travelers is one of the most extraordinary sociological acts in English literary history. He lists them, describes them, each one, and in doing so he creates a portrait of medieval England that no census, no tax record, no royal chronicle could ever have produced. Because what Chaucer captures is not just who was in the room, but what the room itself made possible. A knight who had fought in campaigns across the Mediterranean, his son, the squire, who curled his hair and wrote love poems, and was learning to be fashionable, a prior of gentle manners who fed her dogs on roasted meat and white bread, while pilgrims outside monasteries ate pottage, a monk who wore expensive fur and loved hunting and had no particular interest in his rule, a friar charming and corrupt in equal measure, a merchant whose financial affairs were more troubled than his expensive clothes suggested, a clerk from Oxford who had spent all his money on books and was thin from insufficient eating, a man of law, a franklin, a wealthy freeholder whose table was always laid, a cook who had an open sore on his leg that Chaucer mentions in close proximity to describing his food, which is either a coincidence or a piece of the darkest possible humor. A wife of Bath, 5 times married, traveled to Jerusalem 3 times, Rome twice, and Santiago de Compostela once, with opinions on marriage that she was entirely willing to share at length with anyone who asked, and also anyone who did not. A pardoner selling fake holy relics, a summoner with a face so red and pimpled that children were afraid of him, and Harry Bailey, the innkeeper, the host, the man who proposed the storytelling contest, offered to judge it, and told the assembled company that the prize for the best tale would be a meal at the Tabard paid for by all the others when they returned. What Chaucer understood with the clarity of someone who had actually sat in aunts, like the Tabard, and looked around the room was that the medieval inn was the only space in the entire social order where this particular collection of people could coexist. Nowhere else in 14th century England was a knight sitting beside a cook or a priest, occupying the same hall as a pardoner selling counterfeit relics. The church had its hierarchy. The court had its hierarchy. The guilds had their hierarchies. The village had its fixed order. But the inn had none of these, or rather, it had all of them, simultaneously tumbled together in the specific democracy of people who need the same thing: somewhere to sleep, something to eat, somewhere safe to wait for morning. The Canterbury Tales is, among many other things, an exploration of what happens when that democratic pressure, the pressure of shared need and shared space, is applied to the rigid social categories of a medieval world. Chaucer's pilgrims are not equals. They are emphatically not equals. The knight occupies a different universe of assumption and expectation from the miller, but they are eating at the same tables, sleeping in the same building, and crucially listening to each other's stories. The inn made this possible. The road to Canterbury, which they had to travel together, regardless of rank, made it necessary. Harry Bailey is not a detail in this story. He is the hinge on which the entire narrative turns. The innkeeper who proposes that his guests entertain each other, who manages the group dynamics with a kind of jovial authority, that is entirely consistent with what we know about the actual social power of medieval innkeepers. That combination of hospitality and control that we discussed when talking about Richard Kingsmill. Harry Bailey, historical records confirm, was a real person. He served as a tax collector in Suffolk in exactly the period when Chaucer was writing. He was involved in the poll tax collection of 1381, the same tax that helped trigger the Peasants' Revolt. Whether Chaucer knew him personally or simply knew of him, the use of a real innkeeper as the organizing figure of the Canterbury Tales tells you something deliberate about Chaucer's understanding of what an innkeeper was. Someone whose authority was practical rather than hereditary, whose power came from managing the room, and who understood better than most the strange temporary community that the inn created every night. Have you ever stayed somewhere, a hostel, a long train journey, a delayed flight gate, where you found yourself in conversation with people you would never normally speak to, where the shared situation dissolved briefly, the usual social sorting, and you talked to a stranger about things that mattered? That experience has a medieval ancestor. It was called the inn. The Tabard stood for several hundred years after Chaucer set his story there. It was eventually destroyed in a great fire that swept through Suffolk in 1676. Not the Great Fire of London itself, which stayed north of the river, but a subsequent conflagration that consumed most of medieval Sadok in 17 hours. The site was immediately rebuilt and renamed the Talbot and continued operating as an inn. Today, there is a plaque on Borough High Street where the Tabard once stood. Not much to show for one of the most significant rooms in English literary history, but here is what does remain. The word hospitality, the word hotel, the word hostel, all from the same Latin root hosps, meaning guest or stranger, the person who arrives, the person you did not expect, whom the rule of saint. Benedict commanded you to receive as if you were receiving Christ, and whom the medieval inn received as they were without transformation, with a bowl of pottage and a place near the fire. The Tabard is gone. The Camino hospices have mostly become museums. The locked cellar with its strong boxes is a parking lot. The straw mattress is a memory, but the act itself, the door opening, the warmth, meeting the cold, the stranger becoming for one night a guest that has not ended. It has simply changed its form, and it is changing still right now in every place where someone arrives tired and in need of rest, and someone else decides whether to open the door, which brings us in the very next part to what all of this became. How the medieval inn eventually gave way to something new, what it left behind in the world, and why 7 centuries later you and I are still living inside the world it built. The medieval world did not end on a particular Tuesday. It never does it? Worlds don't end. They shift. They dissolve at the edges. They become something else while still claiming to be what they were. And the medieval inn went through exactly this kind of slow, bewildering transformation, buffeted by forces that had nothing to do with hospitality, but that changed the experience of travel, and therefore the experience of the inn beyond recognition. Let me take you to the moment that I think changed everything. Not a military battle, not a plague, not a famine, though all of those played their roles. The moment I want to tell you about happened in a government office in London in the 1530s, when a man named Thomas Cromwell, chief minister to King Henry VIII, sat down with a set of surveys and began calculating the wealth of the English monasteries. The surveys were called the Valor Ecclesiasticus, literally the church's value, and they were completed in 1535 after commissioners traveled the length of England, Wales, and Ireland, counting, measuring, and recording everything the monasteries owned. The results were staggering. In the 1530s, there were still around 800 monasteries, priories, convents, and friaries across England and Wales alone. They controlled approximately 20% of all cultivated land in Henry's kingdom. Their combined annual income exceeded $130,000 at a time, when this represented extraordinary national wealth. Henry saw this, and being Henry, he wanted it. The formal justification for what followed was religious. Henry had already broken from Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and needed to demonstrate that the old Catholic institutional structures had no further authority on English soil. The practical motivation was simpler money. Henry had expensive wars to fight, expensive palaces to build, and expensive tastes. Generally, the monasteries were the answer. Between 1536 and 1540, in a process of extraordinary speed and ruthlessness, every monastery in England, Wales, and Ireland was dissolved. The monks, nuns, and friars were expelled. Some received small pensions. Some were simply turned out. The great abbeys, Glastonbury, Bury, St. Edmunds, Reading, Walsingham, were stripped of everything valuable and then left to decay. Their lead roofs were melted down for sale. Their carved stone was sold to local builders. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, which had drawn pilgrims for more than 300 years, and toward which countless medieval travelers had walked the roads, we had been following through this entire story, was physically destroyed. The relics were scattered or thrown away. Now, here is what I want you to really feel about this moment in the context of everything we've been talking about. The medieval hospitality system had two pillars, the commercial inn and the sacred guest house. They existed in tension with each other, sometimes in competition, sometimes in collaboration, but always as complements the inn for those who could pay the monastery, for those who could not, and for everyone when the faith required it, regardless of money. In the space of 4 years, one of those pillars was knocked down entirely. The consequences for ordinary travelers were immediate and severe. Historians who have studied the period note that in the years following the dissolution, the number of beggars and vagrants visible on English roads increased dramatically. People who had relied on monastic hospitality, the genuinely poorer, the sick pilgrim, the traveler who had run out of money 3 days from home, now had nowhere to go that was free. The parish poor relief that eventually emerged to fill some of this gap was patchy, underfunded, and operated on the principle that poverty was a personal failing rather than a structural condition, which is a philosophy that produced workhouses rather than guest houses. The pilgrimage routes, meanwhile, were destroyed not just physically but conceptually. Henry's government actively suppressed pilgrimage, declared it superstitious, forbade travel to shrines, removed the sacred objects that had been the destinations of millions of journeys over hundreds of years. The economic ecosystem that had grown up along those routes, the inns built to serve pilgrims, the towns that had flourished because pilgrims passed through the bridges constructed specifically to carry pilgrimage traffic. All of it lost the human flow that had sustained it. Some of the monastic guest houses that had survived by serving wealthier travelers were sold off and converted into private inns. The irony is almost beautiful. The places that had once offered hospitality as a sacred duty, receiving guests as if receiving Christ himself, became commercial establishments, charging market rates and keeping no theological obligations whatsoever. The form survived. The spirit departed. But here is the remarkable thing about the commercial and stripped of its sacred counterpart. It did not collapse. It grew because while the 16th century was devastating the old hospitality order, it was also transforming the English road in ways that made travel faster, more common, and eventually available to people who had never traveled before. And the inn adapted to every change. The pivot began with a royal decision in the 1500s. Henry VIII, the same king who had dissolved the monasteries and destroyed the pilgrimage economy, also wanted his royal correspondents to travel faster. He established a network of post horses along the major roads, fresh horses at stations roughly 10 to 15 minutes apart that royal messengers could ride in relay, handing off the king's letters at each station like a baton in a race. The stations needed people to manage them. They needed buildings. They needed stabling and feeding, and the same suite of services that the inn had always provided. The posting system, which began as a royal communication tool, gradually opened to private travelers. For a fee, you could hire post horses yourself, riding relays from station to station, rather than exhausting a single animal over the full journey. Travel that had once required days could be compressed into hours. The road was accelerating. Then, in the middle of the 17th century, came the stagecoach. The idea was simple in principle. Instead of each traveler managing their own horses, a shared vehicle. A coach large enough to hold several passengers would run regular services along fixed routes, stopping at intervals to change horses and allow passengers to eat. The route, the timing, and the service was standardized in a way that individual travel never had been. You did not need to own a horse, arrange your own provisions, or negotiate each night's accommodation individually. You bought a ticket, and you traveled in the company of strangers, and the inns along the route had been prearranged to expect you. This changed the inn's relationship to travel in a fundamental way. The coaching inn was no longer a place you arrived at by chance hoping for space. It was a scheduled stop. The coaches arrived at known hours. The innkeepers contracted with coach operators to have rooms ready. Horses prepared meals available at specific times. The communal meal at a coaching inn was no longer the uncertain organic gathering of whatever travelers happened to arrive that evening. It was a scheduled performance managed in time like a train schedule, and the inns that served the coaching routes became, in their own era, as impressive and sophisticated as any medieval establishment had been. Major coaching inns, on routes like the Great North Road from London to York, had stabling for dozens of horses. Some could handle 40 coaches a day. The White Hart Inn at Skull in Norfolk was famous for its sign, a sign so elaborate that it straddled the road itself, containing 25 life-size carved figures from classical and mythological tradition, and it cost $1,000 to build and maintain. $1,000, in an era when a skilled craftsman might earn $30 a year. This was marketing at a scale that would not have been recognizable to the medieval innkeeper, and it was effective. The galleried courtyard design that we described in Part 3, those covered wooden walkways running along the upper floor overlooking the stable yard, became the signature architecture of the English coaching inn. And here is a detail that takes us back to something we touched on in Part 6. Some theater historians believe this courtyard design, with its central open performance space and its surrounding galleries, was a direct ancestor of the Elizabethan playhouse. Traveling theater companies in the 16th century performed in exactly these in courtyards. The audience on the gallery walkways, the actors below. When those same companies eventually built permanent theaters, they built them on the same principle. The Globe Theater, the Rose Theater, the Swan, all of them children in some sense of the inn courtyard, which means that the stage on which Shakespeare first presented Hamlet and A Midsummer Night's Dream was architecturally a descendant of the medieval inn. I find that genuinely extraordinary. The coaching era reached its peak in the late 18th and early 19th centuries when the mail coach network reorganized in 1784 to carry the royal mail on contracted coaches rather than individual postboys created the most efficient land communication system England had ever seen. Innkeepers who held mail contracts were essentially running the telecommunications infrastructure of the nation. The inn, once the information node of the medieval world, had become quite literally the postal system. And then, In the 1830s, the railways arrived. The effect was not immediate, but it was inexorable. A train could cover ground that took a coach 4 hours in under 45 minutes. It could carry far more passengers in far greater comfort, and it did not need to stop for fresh horses. The great coaching inns along the main roads began to empty. Some adapted, becoming post offices or market halls or private homes. Some held on as local pubs, shedding their stabling yards, but keeping their bars and their communal rooms. Some were demolished. By 1876, the famous Oxford Arms in London, one of the last great galleried coaching in the capital, was pulled down and replaced by warehouses. The era it represented had ended so decisively that its physical remnant was an embarrassment. What survived the Georgian in Suffolk, rebuilt after the fire of 1606, that destroyed the Tabard, where Chaucer had set his Canterbury Tales, and now managed by the National Trust, stands as the last remaining galleried inn in London. The new inn in Gloucester, built around 1450 by a monk of the Abbey of St. Peter, retains its original courtyard almost intact. You can walk into it today and stand in a space where medieval pilgrims stood looking up at the same gallery. Walkways breathing in, if not the same air, the same architectural proposition. Here is shelter. Here is community. Here is a room big enough for strangers to become briefly something more than strangers. There is a question I want to put to you now, as we come toward the end of this story, and I want you to sit with it genuinely, rather than reaching for the easy answer. What do you think we lost when we lost the inn in its medieval and early modern forms? I have been thinking about this throughout the writing of this entire series, and my honest answer is complicated. We lost the discomfort, obviously, the straw mattress, the shared bed, the bed bugs, the perpetual stew, the cold. We lost the danger, the inns that colluded with highwaymen, the theft in the night, the uncertainty about whether the person you were sharing a room with was trustworthy. We lost the genuine physical hardship of medieval travel, and I'm not nostalgic for any of that. But we also lost something that I do not quite have the right word for: the enforced proximity. Maybe the fact that in a medieval inn, you could not opt out of the social encounter with people unlike yourself. You could not book a private room with guaranteed isolation and order food to be delivered to your door without ever having to look another human being in the face. The inn required you to share space. It required you to be, whether you wanted to be or not, a member of a temporary community with people you would never have chosen to be with. And that temporary, unchosen community, the wool merchant, and the pilgrim, and the itinerant physician, and the wife of Bath, and the quiet man in the corner, who might be a murderer or might be a saint. That was something real, something that the medieval world produced not by design but by necessity, and thus have been slowly, systematically designing out of our lives for the past 2 centuries in the name of comfort and efficiency and the entirely understandable human desire to control our own experience. The Camino de Santiago, we mentioned at the end of Part 9, now attracts more than 200,000 pilgrims a year and growing. Mostly they stay in albergues pilgrim host, where they sleep in bunk beds and communal rooms and share meals with strangers and carry their own packs and walk through the same physical discomfort that medieval pilgrims walk through. And they come home changed in ways they struggle to articulate. They come home talking about the conversations they had, the people they met, the shared experience of the road. They come home with a look that anyone who has read this story will recognize, because what they are finding on a route first walked in significant numbers in the 9th century, and never fully abandoned since, is exactly what the medieval inn was built to provide. The encounter with the stranger, the warmth of the fire, the shared table, the morning that comes after the night, and the road that is waiting on the other side of the door. We have not stopped needing that. We have simply and perhaps temporarily stopped building it into our ordinary lives, which is exactly the thought I want to carry into the final part of this story, because there is a legacy here that goes beyond architecture and beyond nostalgia. There is something the medieval inn understood about the human need for hospitality, for genuine, risky, generous hospitality that we are still slowly relearning, and that is where we are going next. We have been on this road for a long time now, 11 parts more than 2 and 2 hours of traveling together through the smoky halls and the muddy courtyards, and the thin candle light and the strange, brief democracy of strangers sharing a fire. And I want to bring us somewhere specific to end, not a grand cathedral, not a battlefield or a palace. I want to bring us to a courtyard on Borough High Street in Suffolk, London, tucked behind a narrow gate, just a few minutes' walk from London Bridge Station, the George Inn, the last surviving Gallard coaching inn in the city of London. It has been on this site since at least 1542 and possibly much longer. It stood next door to the Tabard in where Chaucer gathered his pilgrims in the 1380s. It was destroyed in the Great Soddock Fire of 1676 and rebuilt the following year in the form it largely holds today. A 3-story timber frame building arranged around what remains of its original courtyard, with 2 tiers of wooden galleries running along the west face, supported on cantilevered beams and Doric columns. The north and east wings were demolished in 1889 by the Great Northern Railway Company, which needed the land for warehouses. What remains is a single wing preserved in 1937 by the National Trust, currently leased to a pub operator and serving pints of ale on the same cobblestones where medieval pilgrims once tied their horses. I find it almost unbearably moving that this single surviving wing is still there. Not because of nostalgia. I have tried to be honest throughout this story about what the medieval inn actually was, which was simultaneously genuinely wonderful and frequently terrible, but because of what it represents as a fact about time and continuity. When Charles Dickens was a boy in the 1820s, his father was imprisoned for debt in the Marshall Setters Prison, just a short walk from the George. Dickens knew this street intimately, knew its smell, and its sound knew the George Inn, the way you know a place that was part of the geography of the worst year of your life. He put it in Little Dorrit decades later as an ordinary, unremarkable place where a character goes to post a letter. Not a historical monument, just a working inn on a London street. The same inn that had served pilgrims heading to Canterbury. The same street where the Tabard had stood. The same neighborhood where Shakespeare's theater companies had performed in courtyards before they had theaters of their own. 6 centuries of unbroken use. One building, one street. Now, let me tell you something about that building that I think crystallizes the entire story we've been telling. In the new inn at Gloucester, built in 1450 by a monk of the Abbey of St. Peter, the most complete surviving medieval courtyard in Britain, there is a gallery on the first floor from which in the summer of 1553 a proclamation was made. Lady Jane Grey, the young woman who had been maneuvered onto the English throne after the death of the young king, Edward VI, was announced as queen from that inn gallery. She held the throne for 9 days. She was then deposed, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and eventually executed. 9 days. The entire arc of her tragic brief reign was bracketed by an announcement made from the gallery of a medieval inn. That gallery exists today. You can stand in the New Inn courtyard in Gloucester and look up at the same gallery from which that announcement was made. The timber is original. The open-jettied walkway is original. The courtyard is original. Something happened there that mattered, that changed the course of English history, however briefly, and the physical space where it happened is still there, still serving food and drink, still welcoming guests. I keep coming back to a question that I think the whole story of the medieval inn ultimately asks. And that question is simply, what is a place? Not a building. I mean, not the physical material of walls and beams and flagstones. Those matter. What makes a place as opposed to just a location? What gives a room its weight, its presence, its sense of being charged with something beyond its physical dimensions? My answer, after spending a very long time inside the history of medieval inns, is this. A place becomes a place through accumulation, through the layering of human experience across time until the walls carry a kind of pressure that is not physical, but that we feel nonetheless. The medieval inn accumulated that pressure faster and more densely than almost any other kind of building in history, because it was specifically designed to receive the full range of human experience passing through it. Joy and grief and commerce and pilgrimage and fear and relief, and the particular repeatable conversation between strangers who will never see each other again. All of it deposited in the walls and the floors, and the low timber ceiling year after year for centuries. And this, I think, is why the few surviving medieval inns feel the way they feel. Why people who step into the Newen courtyard in Gloucester, or duck through the gate into the Georgians' cobbled yard in Suffolk, often report something they struggle to articulate, a sense of weight or resonance, or the particular kind of quiet that comes when a space has been lived in for a very long time by a great many people who have now gone. It is not mystical. It is simply historical. The weight is real. The accumulation is real, and we are sensitive to it, even when we cannot name what we are sensing. Think about what that courtyard in Gloucester has held. The monks who built it, and the pilgrims who first slept within it, the merchants arriving from Bristol, and the royal messengers changing horses in the yard. The night in 1553, when a girl of 15 was declared Queen of England from the gallery above your head, and the hushed, uncertain crowd that heard it. The theater companies who performed in the yard with their stories of kings and lovers and fools before Shakespeare had written a single line. The coaching passengers who arrived muddy and cold from the road and found warmth and food and a place to sleep. And everyone in between, every anonymous traveler, every unnamed pilgrim, every ordinary human being who simply needed what inns have always offered shelter from the dark. All of that in a building you can visit today, or someone will bring you a glass of wine and you can sit in the courtyard and look up at the same gallery and listen to whatever silence remains. Now, I want to tell you something that I find genuinely remarkable about the word hospitality itself, and why it matters how we use it. The word comes from the Latin hospes, which is one of those beautiful, complex Latin words that contains what looks like a contradiction. Hospice means both guest and host simultaneously. The same word for the person who arrives and the person who opens the door. In the Roman world from which this word came, and in the medieval world that inherited it, the relationship between guest and host was understood to be fundamentally reciprocal. You did not simply receive a guest. You entered into a relationship with them governed by mutual obligation, mutual respect, and the acknowledgement that the roles were reversible. Today's host was yesterday's traveler. Today's guest would one day open their own door. The innkeeper and the pilgrim shared a word, and embedded in that shared word was a philosophy of the road, that to travel is to need hospitality, and to have been a traveler is to understand the obligation to extend it in turn. The medieval inn was not a perfect institution. We have been honest about that throughout this story. It was sometimes dangerous, sometimes corrupt, sometimes cold and dirty and inadequate to human need. It excluded the poor. It enabled exploitation. It was used by people with bad intentions as well as good ones. But at its best, and it was very often at its best, it embodied something that we've been losing slowly and steadily for about 2 centuries, and that I think we've been feeling the absence of without quite naming what it is. The willingness to be in a room with people unlike yourself, with no exit and no filter, and no algorithm sorting you toward those who already agree with you. The experience of the unchosen community. The community that forms not because you went looking for people like yourself, but because the road and the darkness and the need for warmth put you in the same building as whoever else happened to arrive that evening. There is a reason the Canterbury Tales begins at an inn. There is a reason every story about roads eventually leads to a room where strangers gather. There is a reason the Camino de Santiago, walked by a handful of devout pilgrims in the 9th century, is now walked by over 200,000 people a year and growing, and that nearly every person who walks it comes home speaking about the conversations they had rather than the scenery they saw. We have not stopped needing this. We have simply built our lives in ways that make it easier to avoid it. I've been thinking throughout the writing of this series about what it would actually feel like to arrive at a medieval inn on a wet October evening in, let us say, 1375. The mud on the road, the horse trembling slightly from a long day, the darkness coming fast, and then through the gate, the courtyard, the smell of a fire, the sound of voices, the innkeeper appearing at the door, looking you over, making a judgment that was simultaneously commercial and moral, deciding whether you were the kind of person who deserved to be let in, and then the warmth, the bowl of something hot, the bench near the fire, the stranger on your left who turns out to be a wool merchant from Winchester who knows the road ahead better than you do, the man on your right who says almost nothing but whose presence is somehow reassuring, the dog sleeping by the hearth, the minstrel tuning his instrument in the corner, the candles burning down. That is the image I keep returning to and that I want to leave you with tonight. Not the medieval inn as a quaint relic or a nostalgic fantasy, but the medieval inn as an argument, a centuries-long, imperfect, sometimes dangerous, often deeply human argument that the act of receiving a stranger is one of the most important things a civilization can do, that the door you open or close says something essential about the kind of world you want to live in, that the warmth you offer or withhold echoes forward through time in ways you will never be able to fully trace. The Benedictines wrote it into their rule in the 6th century. It is still true. Every guest is a stranger until you open the door. And that is where the inn story ends, not with a building, not with a regulation, not with a historical date. It ends with the door, with the choice of whether to open it. The same choice that has been made millions of times by millions of people in millions of buildings across 1,000 years of European history, the same choice that is made every time someone extends genuine hospitality, not the commercial, managed, reviewed, and rated hospitality of a modern hotel chain, but the older, stranger, more demanding kind that asks you to receive the unknown person, as if their need matters as much as your comfort. The medieval inn is gone in almost every physical sense, but the question it asked and the best answer it was sometimes generously given to it, that has not gone anywhere at all. Thank you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, for traveling all 12 parts of this road. We started with a simple question. What was it actually like to stay at a medieval inn? And ended up somewhere I did not entirely expect when I began, in the theology of hospitality, in the architecture of human need, in a courtyard in Gloucester, where a 15-year-old girl was pronounced queen, where theater companies perform before Shakespeare had a stage, and where you can still order a glass of wine and look up at the gallery and feel the weight of everything that happened there. I genuinely hope this story gave you something. Not just information, but that particular feeling of walking around inside another world, recognizing things, understanding why people made the choices they made. History is most alive when it feels like a conversation with the past, and that is what I am always trying to create for you. If this video moved you, made you think, or simply kept you company on a quiet evening, please consider leaving a like or dropping a comment below, telling me which part of the story stayed with you most. Was it the Buffett sleep? The innkeeper's extraordinary dual life as judge in Bailiff? The pilgrims on the Camino? The Tabard in Chaucer's extraordinary room of strangers? I read every comment, and your responses genuinely shape the stories I choose to tell next. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is always another story waiting, another door to open, another fire to sit beside. The next journey is already being prepared, and I think you're going to want to be there for it. Sleep well, travel safely, and remember, every stranger at your door is someone who has been on the road for a long time.